There's a world beneath our world, a shadow Earth that existed long before anything we recognize today ever drew breath, long before the first bird sang, long before the first flower bloomed, long before the great reptilian giants that we have come to know and love from museums and motion pictures ever left a single footprint in the ancient mud. It is a world of staggering violence and breathtaking beauty, a world ruled by creatures so alien in their appearance and so terrifying in their power that our modern imaginations can barely contain them. It is a world that most of us have never truly been introduced to, and yet it is the foundation upon which every single living thing on this planet was built. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on that shadow Earth. Tonight, we go deeper than the dinosaurs. Tonight, we go all the way back to the very beginning of complex life, and we follow the thread of predation, dominance, and extinction across 500 million years of planetary history. What you're about to hear will fundamentally change the way you think about life, about time, and about what it truly means to rule this world. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. We begin with a number, 500 million years. Say it slowly. Let it settle into your mind. 500 million years. That is the approximate span of time during which complex, multicellular animal life has existed on this planet in forms sophisticated enough to leave meaningful fossil records, forms sophisticated enough to hunt, to flee, to compete, to dominate, and to die out in waves of extinction that reshape the biological fabric of the entire world. 500 million years is a span of time so immense that the human mind genuinely cannot process it in any intuitive way. We have no instinct for deep time. We were not built for it. Our brains evolved to track seasons, lifetimes, and perhaps the memory of a few generations of ancestors. The scale of geological and evolutionary time sits entirely outside our natural cognitive reach, and so we must build bridges to it, construct metaphors and comparisons that give us handholds on that otherwise smooth and vertical cliff of incomprehensible duration. Here is one such bridge. If you were to compress all 500 million years of complex animal life on Earth into a single 24-hour day, a single rotation of our planet, then each hour of that day would represent roughly 21 million years of actual history. Each minute would represent approximately 350,000 years. Each second would swallow up nearly 6,000 years of evolutionary time. On that scale, all of recorded human history, every empire, every war, every invention, every written word, every cathedral, every ocean voyage, every revolution, would be compressed into the final half-second of that 24-hour day. The entire span of the human species as a recognizable biological entity would occupy no more than the final 10 seconds of the day. And the dinosaurs, those magnificent and terrible creatures that so dominate our cultural imagination of prehistoric life, would occupy only the stretch of time between roughly 4 in the afternoon and just before 10 in the evening. Impressive, certainly, a reign of extraordinary length by any reasonable measure. But the day started at midnight, and by 4 in the afternoon the world had already seen kingdoms rise and fall, empires of flesh and claw that most people have never heard of, predators of such power and sophistication that the dinosaurs themselves were, in a very real sense, simply the latest in a long line of dominant life forms, not the first, not necessarily the greatest, and certainly not the last. This is the story that is so rarely told. This is the story we are going to tell tonight. To understand the predators that ruled this planet before, between, and after the age of dinosaurs, we first need to understand the world in which they lived, because that world was not the world we inhabit today. It was, in many fundamental respects, a completely different planet. The continents were arranged differently. The atmosphere had a different chemical composition. The oceans were chemically distinct. The temperatures were different. Even the length of the day was different, because the gravitational interaction between Earth and its moon has been slowly but steadily lengthening our days over geological time, meaning that in the deep past, Earth rotated faster, days were shorter, and the planet had a subtly different rhythm to its existence. All of these factors, seemingly abstract and geological in nature, had profound and direct consequences for the living things that inhabited this world, for the body sizes they could achieve, for the environments they could exploit, for the predatory strategies they could employ, and for the catastrophic vulnerabilities they would eventually face. The story of predation on this planet is therefore inseparable from the story of the planet itself. The great predators of prehistory were not simply animals. They were biological expressions of specific planetary conditions, creatures shaped by particular temperature, oxygen, geography, and chemistry, And when those conditions changed, as they inevitably always did, those predators faced a stark and simple choice: adapt, migrate, or perish. Most of them perished, and in their perishing, they cleared the ecological stage for whatever came next, for the next act in this long and violent drama of life on Earth. Story in roughly chronological order, from the oldest chapters, though we will occasionally need to circle back to ones that span hundreds of millions of years. The world we will visit is strange and often counterintuitive, and we will need to stop frequently to explain the context that makes each predator's dominance possible and each extinction comprehensible. But at every stage we will return to the central question that drives this entire investigation. What did it actually mean to be the apex predator of the world at any given moment in the last 500 million years? What was the experience of dominance? What were its costs? And what ultimately brought each reign to its end? Let us go back then, all the way back, before the first dinosaur, before the first mammal, before the first reptile, before the first land animal of any kind. Let us go back to a time when the entire theater of complex animal life was played out in the oceans of an ancient world, in seas that covered a planet whose geography was so different from our own that it would have been entirely unrecognizable to any modern navigator. We are going to the Cambrian period. We are going to a time approximately 540 million years ago, give or take a few million years on either side, to the moment that evolutionary biologists and paleontologists have come to call the Cambrian Explosion. This name is simultaneously one of the evocative and one of the most misleading phrases in all of science. The word explosion suggests something instantaneous, something that happened in a flash, and in geological terms, quickly, perhaps over a span of somewhere between 5 and 25 million years, which in the context of Earth's overall history is indeed relatively brief. But in absolute terms, 5 to 25 million years is an enormous span of time, longer by far than the entire span of time that has elapsed since the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. So the Cambrian explosion was not literally an explosion. It was more like an extraordinarily rapid flowering, a sudden and dramatic diversification of animal life from relatively simple forms into an astonishing array of new body plans, new strategies, new ecological roles, and new possibilities. Before the Cambrian, the oceans of Earth were populated largely by organisms of limited complexity. There were single-celled organisms, bacterial mats, and enigmatic multicellular creatures of the Ediacaran period that preceded the Cambrian, soft-bodied things that resembled quilted fronds and discs and tubes, organisms that apparently lacked mouths, digestive systems, and the ability to move in any meaningful way. They were filter feeders, absorbers of nutrients from the surrounding water and sediment, passive inhabitants of a relatively peaceful ocean world. They had no eyes. They had no claws, they had no weapons of offense or defense. In a very real sense, they existed in an ecological state that can only be described as prelapsarian, a world before predation, before the cold economy of eat or be eaten that would come to define all subsequent animal life on this planet. The Cambrian explosion changed everything. Within what was geologically speaking a geological eye blink, animals with legs appeared, animals with shells appeared. Animals with claws appeared, and with claws and eyes and legs came something that had not meaningfully existed before in the history of complex life on Earth: active, purposeful predation, the pursuit of one animal by another, the strategy of killing for food. This single ecological innovation, this terrible gift of predation, was the engine that drove the Cambrian explosion forward, because predation created an immediate and urgent evolutionary pressure on every prey organism to develop better defenses, and every improvement in defense created a corresponding pressure on predators to develop better offensive capabilities. And this escalating biological arms race generated an explosion of evolutionary innovation that produced the extraordinary diversity of life forms we see preserved in the fossil records of the Cambrian period. Among all the creatures that emerged from this extraordinary crucible of evolutionary innovation, one stands out above all others as the defining apex predator of its age. Its name is Anomalocaris canadensis, and it is in many ways the first great hunter in the history of complex animal life on this planet. The name Anomalocaris means, roughly translated, abnormal shrimp, and this somewhat unimpressive name has an appropriately comic origin story in the history of paleontology. The creature was first known to science only from fragments, as is the case with so many of the ancient predators we will discuss tonight, and those fragments were so bizarre and so unlike anything living scientists had encountered before that the initial researchers who examined them had absolutely no idea that they were looking at parts of a single, coherent animal. The circular, disc-like mouth structure of Anomalocaris was initially described as a jellyfish. The grasping frontal appendages were described as the bodies of shrimp without their heads, which is why the genus received the name it did. It was only when more complete specimens were eventually discovered and the pieces were finally assembled correctly that the full, extraordinary reality of Anomalocaris emerged. Anomalocaris canadensis was, by the standards of the Cambrian ocean world it inhabited, absolutely enormous. Most Cambrian animals were tiny, measured in millimeters or at most a few centimeters. Anomalocaris canadensis could reach lengths of somewhere between 60 centimeters and potentially over a meter, possibly even approaching 2 meters in some estimates, depending on which fossil material and which size extrapolation methodology you accept. In a world of millimeter-scale organisms, an animal the length of your arm or longer was not merely large. It was incomprehensibly, terrifyingly gargantuan. It was the equivalent, in terms of relative scale within its ecosystem, of something more dramatic than any predator we can easily imagine in our own modern world. The body of Anomalocaris was a marvel of early evolutionary engineering. It was fundamentally a free-swimming predator, propelled through the water by a series of overlapping lateral lobes along its flanks that undulated in coordinated waves, driving the animal forward with a motion somewhat similar to that of a modern cuttlefish or a flatworm, though the underlying mechanics were quite different. The head of Anomalocaris bore 2 enormous compound eyes on stalks, eyes of extraordinary complexity that would have provided the animal with superb vision in the well-lit shallow marine environments it typically inhabited. Research into the fossilized structure of these eyes, published in relatively recent years, has revealed that they were remarkably sophisticated optical instruments, comparable in their complexity to the compound eyes of modern predatory insects, and certainly among the most advanced visual organs of any Cambrian organism. In a world where many prey animals were either completely blind or possessed only the most rudimentary light-sensing organs, the sharp, wide-field vision of Anomalocaris gave it an overwhelming predatory advantage. But the most distinctive and most fearsome features of Anomalocaris were its frontal appendages and its mouth. The frontal appendages, which had initially been mistaken for shrimp bodies, were a pair of segmented, flexible, grasping structures, each armed with sharp spines that projected forward from the front of the animal's head. These appendages could be extended to seize prey and then retracted, drawing the captured animal toward the circular, tooth-lined mouth that sat on the underside of the creature's head. That mouth is one of the most extraordinary structures in all of Cambrian paleontology. It was a circular, iris-like structure composed of a ring of overlapping plates, each equipped with teeth or tooth-like projections, and the entire apparatus could open and close in a manner somewhat reminiscent of a camera aperture. When Anomalocaris bit down on prey, those overlapping plates came together, the teeth tearing and crushing whatever had been caught in those deadly frontal appendages. For millions of years, through the Cambrian period and into the subsequent Ordovician period, variants and relatives of Anomalocaris ruled the world's oceans as the dominant large predators. They were diverse, they were widespread, and they were adaptable, occupying a range of ecological roles from active pursuit predators to potential filter feeders, demonstrating even at this early stage in the history of complex life a characteristic of successful predatory lineages: the capacity to diversify and exploit multiple ecological opportunities. Some Anomalocarid relatives grew to even larger sizes than Anomalocaris canadensis itself. Aegirocassis, a related genus from the Ordovician, was a giant filter feeder, straining plankton from the water through specialized frontal appendages modified from the grasping tools of its predatory relatives, in a convergence of ecological strategy remarkably parallel to the evolution of filter feeding in modern baleen whales from predatory ancestors. But the reign of the Anomalocaridids, for all its length and for all its dominance, eventually came to an end. The Ordovician period, which followed the Cambrian, closed with one of the 5 great mass extinction events in Earth's history, an event triggered by a dramatic glaciation of the southern polar supercontinent and a corresponding drop in global sea levels and ocean temperatures that devastated the warm, shallow marine ecosystems that had been the primary theater of complex animal life since the Cambrian explosion. The exact toll of the end Ordovician extinction is debated among researchers, but it is generally estimated to have eliminated somewhere between 60 and 85% of all marine species on the planet. In the aftermath of that catastrophe, the world's oceans were ecologically reset, and when new apex predators arose to fill the vacant niches, they were different creatures, the products of new evolutionary trajectories set in motion by the survivors of the extinction. The period that followed the Ordovician extinction is called the Silurian, and in its wake came the Devonian, a period of such extraordinary significance in the history of life on Earth that it has earned the popular title of the Age of Fishes. This is not an entirely accurate label, but it captures something genuinely important about the Devonian. It was during this period that jawed vertebrates, the lineage to which all fish, all amphibians, all reptiles, all birds, and all mammals ultimately belong, first came to genuine ecological prominence. The Devonian saw the diversification of fish into an extraordinary range of body forms and ecological roles, from tiny filter feeders to massive, armored pursuit predators, and it was during the Devonian that the oceans of Earth saw the emergence of some of the most formidable fish-based predators in the entire history of vertebrate life. Chief among the predatory marvels of the Devonian was a group of fish called the placoderms, armored fish whose heads and upper bodies were encased in articulated plates of bone and dermal armor. Placoderms were an enormously successful group that dominated Devonian marine and freshwater ecosystems for tens of millions of years, and they ranged in size from small, bottom-dwelling forms to genuinely enormous apex predators. The largest and most fearsome of all the placoderms, and by many measures the most powerful predatory fish in all of Earth's history, was Dunkleosteus terrelli. Dunkleosteus terrelli is one of those prehistoric animals whose reality is so extreme that it verges on the mythological. It was massive. Estimates of its full body length based on the fossil material available, which consists primarily of the armored head and anterior trunk section, with the soft-bodied posterior portions rarely preserved, range from around 4 meters to potentially as much as 9 or 10 meters for the largest individuals, placing the biggest specimens in the size range of a modern great white shark or larger. But raw size, impressive as it is, was not the most extraordinary thing about Dunkleosteus. The most extraordinary thing was its bite. Dunkleosteus, like all placoderms, did not have teeth in the conventional sense. Instead, its jaws were equipped with self-sharpening blades of exposed bone, sharp-edged plates that functioned with devastating effectiveness as biological scissors. Biomechanical analyses of the skull structure and jaw mechanics of Dunkleosteus, using the laws of physics and engineering applied to the fossil material, have produced estimates of the bite force of this animal that place it among the most powerful jaws of any animal that has ever lived. Some analyses have suggested that the bite force of Dunkleosteus may have exceeded 4,000 newtons at the tips of those bone blades, with total jaw-closing force potentially several times higher than that. To put this in perspective, a large modern great white shark has a bite force estimated at around 18,000 newtons, but the comparison is complicated by differences in jaw geometry, body size, and the specific mechanics of how that force is delivered. What is beyond dispute is that Dunkleosteus possessed one of the most mechanically efficient and devastatingly powerful jaws of any vertebrate predator in the fossil record, and that it was fully capable of biting through the thick bone armor of other large placoderms, as evidenced by fossil discoveries of placoderm bones bearing marks consistent with Dunkleosteus bites. Beyond its jaw, Dunkleosteus had another remarkable characteristic: speed. Despite its enormous bulk, mechanical analyses of its skull and jaw structure suggest that Dunkleosteus was capable of opening its jaws with extraordinary rapidity, creating a powerful suction effect that would have drawn prey toward the mouth before the jaws even fully opened. This suction-feeding capability, combined with the shearing power of those bone blades, made Dunkleosteus an almost inescapable predator for anything it targeted in its Devonian ocean world. It lived in warm, shallow seas that covered large portions of what are now the major continental landmasses, seas that teemed with an extraordinary diversity of fish, cephalopods, and other marine life. At the top of all those food chains sat Dunkleosteus, the lord of the Devonian Ocean, the apex of the first great age of vertebrate predation. And yet, even Dunkleosteus and all its placoderm kin faced a reckoning. The Devonian period, so rich in biological diversity and so innovative in its production of new life forms, ended in catastrophe. The end of the Devonian, approximately 370 million years ago, saw a series of extinction pulses collectively known as the Late Devonian extinction, a prolonged ecological crisis that unfolded over several million years and eliminated perhaps 70 to 80% of all species on Earth. The the placoderms were among the victims. Not a single placoderm lineage survived into the subsequent Carboniferous period. Dunkleosteus and its entire remarkable armored kindred were gone, permanently erased from the living world, leaving behind only the bones that would eventually be extracted from ancient rock by curious scientists hundreds of millions of years later. But before we follow the consequences of that extinction into the Carboniferous, we need to pause and address one of the most significant transitions in all of the history of life on this planet, one that happened during the Devonian, and that would ultimately prove to be the foundation of all terrestrial life that followed, the colonization of the land. Throughout the Devonian period, while the great drama of aquatic predation was playing out in the seas, a quieter but ultimately more consequential revolution was taking place at the margins of the ancient world's waterways. Certain lineages of fish, belonging to a group called the lobe-finned fishes, had developed fleshy, muscular fins with an internal skeletal structure that bore a remarkable resemblance to the basic limb architecture that would eventually be elaborated into the arms, legs, wings, and flippers of all terrestrial vertebrates. These lobe-finned fish were exploiting shallow, oxygen-poor freshwater environments where their ability to breathe air, a capability that several lineages had independently evolved, gave them a significant advantage over pure water breathers when dissolved oxygen levels in their aquatic environments dropped. Over millions of years of evolution, certain of these fish became increasingly capable of supporting their weight on their modified fins in shallow water and on land, increasingly capable of locomoting on solid ground, increasingly capable of exploiting the terrestrial environment that had, until this point in Earth's history, been essentially devoid of vertebrate life. The exact sequence of events is still a matter of active research and sometimes vigorous debate among paleontologists, but the broad outline is clear. During the Devonian, the vertebrate transition from water to land began, and the descendants of those first amphibious pioneers would eventually give rise to the entire remarkable lineage of tetrapods, the four-limbed vertebrates that includes every amphibian, every reptile, every bird, and every mammal that has ever walked, crawled, slithered, or flown across the surface of this planet. The earliest land-venturing vertebrates were not the dominant predators of their terrestrial environments, at least not initially. The land, by the time vertebrates arrived, had already been colonized by a variety of invertebrates, early insects, arachnids, myriapods, and other arthropods that had preceded the vertebrates onto land, and had established themselves as the dominant life forms of the terrestrial world during the Silurian and early Devonian. When the first vertebrate amphibians hauled themselves ashore during the Late Devonian, they entered an already established ecosystem, one in which they were initially more prey than predator, small and vulnerable compared to some of the arthropod giants that already inhabited the land. This situation would change dramatically in the period that followed. The Carboniferous period, which ran from approximately 360 million to 300 million years ago, is one of the most atmospherically distinctive intervals in Earth's entire history, and that atmospheric distinctiveness had direct and profound consequences for the biology of every organism that lived during that time. The defining characteristic of Carboniferous Earth was an extraordinary abundance of oxygen in the atmosphere. To understand why the Carboniferous atmosphere was so oxygen-rich, we need to understand what defined the Carboniferous landscape. The period takes its name from coal, because the vast coal deposits that powered the Industrial Revolution and shaped the economic and political history of the last 3 centuries were formed largely from the compressed and transformed remains of Carboniferous forests. These were not forests as we would recognize them today. They were dominated by enormous tree-like plants, club mosses, horsetails, and seed ferns that could reach heights of 30 to 50 meters, creating dense, towering canopies over vast tropical swamps that covered enormous portions of what were then the equatorial regions of the assembled supercontinent. The critical detail is this: wood, as a biological material, had only very recently evolved in the Devonian, and the fungi and bacteria capable of efficiently decomposing wood had not yet evolved to keep pace with the production of this new material. As a result, when trees died in Carboniferous forests, their wood did not fully decompose. It accumulated, was buried, was compressed, and over geological time became coal. But the important consequence for our story is that as this organic carbon was buried and removed from the carbon cycle, the atmospheric oxygen that had been locked up in carbon-oxygen bonds in those plant tissues was released back into the atmosphere. Over tens of millions of years, this process drove atmospheric oxygen levels to extraordinary heights. Best estimates suggest that atmospheric oxygen during the peak of the Carboniferous period may have reached concentrations of around 35% of the atmosphere, compared to the approximately 21% that characterizes our modern atmosphere. This elevated oxygen level had dramatic physiological consequences for animal life. For arthropods, insects, and other invertebrates that breathe through a passive system of tubes called tracheae that allow oxygen to diffuse into their tissues, higher atmospheric oxygen directly enabled the evolution of much larger body sizes, because the passive diffusion of oxygen through these tubes becomes a limiting factor on body size under normal oxygen concentrations. And removing that limitation by dramatically increasing the oxygen concentration in the air allowed arthropod body plans to scale to sizes that would be physiologically impossible today. The consequences of this atmospheric oxygen enrichment for Carboniferous arthropods were nothing short of spectacular. Dragonfly-like insects of the order Meganeura, the griffin flies, grew to sizes with wingspans approaching 75 centimeters, nearly 30 inches from wingtip to wingtip, making them the largest that have ever existed. Scorpions of the Carboniferous reached lengths of 70 centimeters or more. And perhaps the most dramatic example of Carboniferous gigantism was the millipede Arthropleura, which holds the distinction of being the largest land-dwelling invertebrate in the known history of life on Earth. Arthropleura was extraordinary by any measure. Based on fossil trackways and the fragmentary body fossils that have been discovered, this animal could reach lengths of 2.5 meters, approximately 8 feet, and may have been considerably wider than its length would suggest, with a broad, flattened body divided into numerous armored segments, each bearing a pair of legs. The total leg count would have been somewhere in the dozens, and the coordinated movement of all those legs would have given Arthropleura a distinctive, flowing wave-like locomotion as it moved through the dense undergrowth of Carboniferous coal forests. Its fossil trackways have been found across what is now Europe, and those trackways show an animal that was clearly comfortable moving across a variety of substrates, from soft, muddy ground to firmer surfaces. What Arthropleura ate is a question that has generated considerable debate among paleontologists. For a long time, it was assumed that an animal of such enormous size must have been at least partially carnivorous, perhaps preying on smaller invertebrates and even on the early tetrapod vertebrates that were beginning to diversify in Carboniferous terrestrial environments. However, analysis of gut contents preserved in some Arthropleura fossils has suggested that this giant millipede may have been primarily or even exclusively herbivorous, feeding on the spores, seeds, and vegetative material available in abundance in Carboniferous forests. If this interpretation is correct, then Arthropleura was the largest land-dwelling herbivore of its time rather than a predator, though its sheer size would have made it largely immune to predation by anything living in its environment, giving it a kind of passive dominance through scale. The true apex predators of the Carboniferous terrestrial world were not the giant arthropods but rather the vertebrates, and specifically the early amphibians and the first reptiles that were evolving in the rich ecological theater of the coal forests. Early tetrapods like Protogyrinus and Megaps were formidable ambush predators in the shallow swamps and waterways of the coal forests, capable of catching fish, invertebrates, and smaller tetrapods with surprising efficiency. And as the Carboniferous progressed, the first true reptiles evolved from amphibian ancestors, making the revolutionary biological breakthrough of the amniotic egg, an egg with a protective membrane system that allowed reproduction on land without dependence on standing water. And with this innovation, the vertebrate conquest of the terrestrial world truly began in earnest. The transition from the Carboniferous into the subsequent Permian period, which lasted from approximately 300 million to 252 million years ago, saw the gradual drying of many of the great equatorial swamps as the global climate shifted, a change that eliminated the specific conditions that had produced the extraordinary oxygen levels of the Carboniferous. As oxygen levels declined back towards something closer to modern concentrations, the gigantic arthropods that had thrived under the high oxygen conditions were progressively disadvantaged, and the vertebrates, whose respiratory systems were not limited in the same way by oxygen concentration, continued their diversification and expansion into every available terrestrial ecological niche. The Permian period is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated chapters in the entire history of life on Earth, because it was during the Permian that the group of vertebrates that would eventually give rise to all mammals, including ourselves, rose to ecological dominance for the first time. These were the synapsids, a broad group of amniote vertebrates characterized by a specific skull morphology, and during the Permian they diversified into an extraordinary range of body forms, ecological roles, and sizes, culminating in some of the most formidable land predators that had yet existed anywhere on this planet. The early Permian was dominated by a group of synapsids called the pelycosaurs, a somewhat informal grouping that included both herbivorous and carnivorous forms. The most recognizable of the pelycosaurs to modern audiences is probably Dimetrodon, the dramatic sail-backed predator that is so frequently and incorrectly included in collections of toy dinosaurs. Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur. It was not even particularly closely related to dinosaurs. It was a synapsid, much more closely related to mammals than to any reptile, and it predated the first dinosaurs by approximately 50 million years. But its dramatic dorsal sail, composed of elongated neural spines from the vertebrae and likely covered in skin and rich in blood vessels, made it one of the most visually distinctive animals of the Permian, and its ecological role as an apex terrestrial predator of the early Permian was unambiguous. Dimetrodon came in multiple species ranging from about 1.5 meters to over 3 meters in length, and the largest species were the dominant predators of their time and place, capable of taking prey up to their own size or larger. Their teeth were differentiated into different types, a condition called heterodonty that would become more elaborate and more sophisticated in their synapsid descendants, and which contrasts with the uniform, peg-like or cone-like teeth of most reptiles. This differentiation of teeth into cutting teeth and holding teeth already hints at the direction in which the synapsid lineage was heading, toward the complex, multifunctional dentition of mammals. But the most dramatic and ecologically consequential of all the Permian synapsid predators were not the pelycosaurs but their successors, a more derived group called the therapsids. The therapsids arose from pelycosaur ancestors during the Middle Permian and quickly came to dominate the terrestrial ecosystems of the time to a degree that is genuinely difficult to overstate. They were more active than their pelycosaur predecessors, with limb postures that were more erect and efficient for sustained locomotion. Some of them showed evidence of at least rudimentary temperature regulation, hints of the endothermy that would eventually characterize all mammals. They diversified into a remarkable range of ecological roles, including large herbivores, small insectivores, and large carnivores of terrifying capability. Among all the therapsid predators of the Permian, none was more formidable, and none better illustrates the concept of biological dominance than Inostrancevia. This animal was a member of a therapsid group called the Gorgonopsians, fearsome predators characterized by long skulls, powerful jaws, and most remarkably by extremely elongated, saber-like canine teeth that projected downward from the upper jaw even when the mouth was closed. The Gorgonopsians as a group were the dominant large predators of the late Permian world, and Inostrancevia, the largest of their kind, was their most spectacular representative. Inostrancevia was, by the standards of the late Permian terrestrial world, enormous. The largest specimens reached body lengths of perhaps 3.5 meters or more, with skulls that could approach 60 centimeters in length. Those skulls were dominated by the extraordinary saber canine teeth, which in the largest individuals could reach lengths of 15 centimeters or more, curved, blade-like weapons of bone that would have been devastating instruments of predation. The jaw mechanics of Gorgonopsians like Inostrancevia are fascinating. The lower jaw could be depressed to an extraordinary angle, perhaps 90 degrees or more, allowing those enormous upper canines to be deployed fully and effectively against prey. This is a mechanical solution to the challenge of using long fangs that would appear again, convergently and independently, in several other saber-toothed predator lineages throughout subsequent Earth history. What did Inostrancevia prey upon? The late Permian terrestrial world was populated by large, sometimes enormous herbivorous therapsids, including the dicynodonts, barrel-bodied animals with a pair of tusks and a turtle-like beak that were among the most successful and abundant of all Permian land animals. The largest dicynodonts were formidable animals, potentially approaching the size of modern large ungulates, and they likely formed the primary prey base for predators like Inostrancevia. Recent fossil discoveries have even suggested direct evidence of predation interactions between Gorgonopsians and their prey, with fossil material showing bones bearing bite marks and trauma consistent with Gorgonopsian attacks. The image that emerges from all this fossil evidence is of a late Permian terrestrial world dominated by these remarkable proto-mammalian animals, a world in which the ecological roles that we more familiarly associate with large cats and their prey were occupied by creatures that were, in their underlying biology, much more like our own distant ancestors than like any reptile. The Permian was, in a very real sense, the first age of quasi-mammals, a world in which the synapsid lineage had achieved not just diversity, but genuine biological supremacy over the terrestrial realm. And then it ended, in the most catastrophic way possible, in the most catastrophic mass extinction that has ever befallen complex animal life on this planet. The Permian Triassic extinction event, which occurred approximately 252 million years ago at the boundary between the Permian and the Triassic periods, is known to paleontologists by a name that speaks directly to the scale of its devastation, the Great Dying. This was not just another extinction event of the kind that periodically punctuated the history of life. This was something categorically worse, something so catastrophically severe that it came terrifying the entire grand experiment of complex animal life on this planet. Current estimates derived from the painstaking analysis of fossil bed after fossil bed around the world suggest that the Permian Triassic extinction eliminated somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species and somewhere between 70 and 75% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. Think about those numbers: 90 to 96% of all marine species, gone, forever, in geological terms essentially instantaneously. The cause or causes of the Permian Triassic extinction are still actively debated by researchers, though a strong consensus has emerged around a primary driver: the eruption of an extraordinarily massive volcanic system in what is now Siberia, known as the Siberian Traps, which released incomprehensible volumes of volcanic gases, primarily carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, over a period estimated at somewhere between hundreds of thousands to a couple of million years. The consequences of this eruption were cascading and mutually reinforcing. Rapid global warming as carbon dioxide accumulated in the atmosphere, ocean acidification as carbon dioxide dissolved in seawater and formed carbonic acid, anoxia or oxygen depletion in the oceans as warm water holds less dissolved oxygen, and as the massive die-off of marine organisms created bacterial blooms that consumed the remaining oxygen. Potentially a collapse of the ozone layer due to volcanic halogens, exposing the surface of the planet to intense ultraviolet radiation, and possibly a runaway feedback cycle as warming temperatures melted methane hydrates on the ocean floor, releasing additional greenhouse gases in a self-amplifying spiral of environmental catastrophe. The result was an ocean that was, in many regions, effectively a biological dead zone, and a land surface that was stressed to the point of collapse. The elaborate ecosystems that the Permian had built over tens of millions of years of evolutionary investment were destroyed. The magnificent Gorgonopsians in Australasia and all its kin were wiped from existence. The large dicynodonts were catastrophically reduced. The complex ecological webs of the Permian terrestrial world were torn, leaving behind only the hardiest, most generalized, most resilient survivors to rebuild life in the aftermath of would face an empty world of vacant ecology to be filled. Conquest would take years and would process a new predators unlike had seen before. The Triassic followed the extinction approximately 1 million years, a time of slow recovery, reconstruction. The early world that was still carrying scars, populated number of survivors eking out a world that had biological, the rapid have established ecological recovery from the Permian Triassic extinction took somewhere between 5 and 10 million years, an extraordinarily long time that speaks to just how thoroughly the event had shattered the biological infrastructure of the planet. But recovery did come, as it has always come after every extinction event in Earth's history, driven by the inexhaustible engine of evolution and the relentless pressure of life to fill every available ecological space with living organisms. And as the Triassic progressed and ecosystems rebuilt themselves, a new competition emerged for dominance of the terrestrial world, a competition whose outcome we all know, because one of the competitors in that Triassic contest was the ancestor of the dinosaurs. But what most people do not know is that the dinosaurs did not immediately win that competition. For a significant portion of the Triassic period, the dinosaurs were a minor player in a game dominated by other, now largely forgotten groups of reptiles, and chief among those dominant reptile groups were the animals we call the Rhesuchids. The Rhesuchids, sometimes also referred to as Rhesuchians or Papasaurs in their broader grouping, were large, predatory archosaurs, members of the same broad evolutionary lineage that included both the ancestors of crocodilians and the ancestors of dinosaurs. But the Rhesuchids occupied a body plan and an ecological role distinctly different from their crocodilian cousins. They were fully terrestrial, fully upright, active pursuit predators, built along body plan lines that convergently resembled, in many respects, the body plans that the theropod dinosaurs would later evolve independently. The most famous and most studied of the Rhesuchids is Postosuchus kirkpatricki, an animal that was the apex terrestrial predator of much of what is now the western portion of the northern supercontinent during the late Triassic period, approximately 220 to 210 million years ago. Postosuchus was, by any measure, a formidable animal. Estimates of its body length run to around 5 or 6 meters for the largest individuals, making it comparable in size to a large theropod dinosaur like Allosaurus. Its skull was large and deep, bearing numerous serrated blade-like teeth well suited for tearing flesh. Its legs were arranged in an erect posture beneath its body, rather than sprawling out to the sides as in modern crocodilians, giving it the efficient locomotion of a true terrestrial pursuit predator. And there is ongoing debate among paleontologists about whether Postosuchus was primarily bipedal, running on its hind legs like a theropod dinosaur, or primarily quadrupedal. Current evidence suggests it was more likely quadrupedal for most activities, but may have been capable of rearing up on its hind legs when necessary. Postosuchus and its Rhesuchid relatives were the dominant large predators of the Triassic world for tens of millions of years. The dinosaurs, by contrast, were present during this time, but occupied relatively minor ecological roles, mostly as smaller animals in ecosystems dominated by the Rhesuchids and other large archosaurs. This is a point of genuine importance that tends to get lost in popular accounts of prehistoric life. The dinosaurs did not become the dominant life forms on Earth by outcompeting the Rhesuchids in a direct evolutionary contest. The Rhesuchids fell, as so many dominant groups before them had fallen, to an extinction event, specifically the Triassic-Jurassic extinction that occurred approximately 201 million years ago, another volcanic cataclysm associated with the opening of the Atlantic Ocean and the eruption of a massive igneous province in what is now the Central Atlantic region. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction eliminated the Rhesuchids and a number of other large archosaur groups that had been dominating the Triassic world, and it was in the ecological vacuum left by their extinction that the dinosaurs, previously restrained to secondary ecological roles, finally expanded into the full range of terrestrial niches and achieved the dominance that they would maintain for the next 165 million years. The dinosaurs did not conquer the world. They inherited it, as so many apex predators have done throughout Earth's history, not through superiority in direct competition, but through survival of an extinction event that eliminated their rivals. And so we arrive at the age that dominates popular imagination of prehistoric life, the Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs, spanning from the Triassic-Jurassic boundary through the end of the Cretaceous period, a span of approximately 165 million years of dinosaurian dominance of the terrestrial world. We will spend some time here because the Mesozoic was not only the age of terrestrial dinosaur giants, but also the age of some of the most extraordinary marine predators in Earth's history, creatures that ruled the seas with an authority that matched anything happening on land. The Jurassic period, the middle act of the Mesozoic, opened onto a world in the early stages of being reshaped. The great supercontinent of Pangaea, which had assembled during the Permian, was in the process of breaking apart, driven by the same volcanic forces that had caused the Triassic-Jurassic extinction. As Pangaea fragmented, new seaways opened between the separating landmasses, and those seaways created new marine environments, new ecological theaters in which marine life could diversify and produce new forms. The shallow, warm, oxygen-rich seas of the Jurassic became ecological hotbeds of extraordinary richness and diversity. And into those seas, the marine reptiles that had been diversifying since the Triassic reached their apotheosis. Among the most impressive and most terrifying of all Jurassic marine predators were the plesiosaurs, a group of large, long-necked or short-necked marine reptiles that had evolved from terrestrial ancestors earlier in the Mesozoic. Plesiosaurs were divided into two broad groups based on their body proportions. The long-necked plesiosauroids, which had small heads on enormously elongated necks and relatively compact bodies, and the short-necked plesiosaurids, which had massive heads on short, powerful necks and large, torpedo-shaped bodies built for speed and power. It is from the plesiosauroid group that one of the most iconic and most terrifying marine predators in Earth's history emerges, Liopleurodon. The name has become almost legendary in popular culture, amplified enormously by its dramatic portrayal in documentary productions. And while some of the size estimates that entered popular consciousness through those portrayals are now considered exaggerated, the actual animal, the real Liopleurodon ferox as best reconstructed from the fossil evidence, was still a genuinely awe-inspiring predator of the first order. Liopleurodon lived during the late Jurassic period, approximately 160 to 155 million years ago, in the warm, shallow epicontinental seas that covered much of what is now Europe. The fossil material, consisting primarily of skull fragments and isolated teeth, allows paleontologists to reconstruct an animal with a massive, elongated skull, bearing enormous conical teeth well suited for seizing and holding large, struggling prey. The teeth of Liopleurodon were considerable weapons in themselves, robust, slightly recurved, with oval cross-sections that gave them strength against the lateral forces generated by a large prey animal trying to escape from the grip of those jaws. How large was Liopleurodon? This is a question that has generated considerable debate. Early and somewhat sensationalized estimates placed it at 25 meters or more in length, making it larger than any known animal in Earth's history. Modern, more conservative analyses of the actual fossil material suggest a more realistic figure of perhaps 6 to 7 meters for well-represented individuals, with the possibility of larger individuals based on fragmentary material. Even at 6 or 7 meters, Liopleurodon was a significant predator in its Jurassic ocean world, broadly comparable in size to a large modern killer whale. The key difference in its ecological impact lay in the nature of the prey available to it. The Jurassic seas teemed with large ichthyosaurs, sharks, large fish, and other plesiosaurs, and Liopleurodon sat near or at the top of that food web. But Liopleurodon was only one among many remarkable marine predators of the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. The ichthyosaurs, dolphin-convergent marine reptiles that had been present since the Triassic, reached their greatest sizes and produced some of their most impressive predatory forms during the Jurassic. The marine crocodilians, a group of crocodile relatives that had secondarily invaded the marine environment and evolved paddle-like limbs and fish-like tails for efficient aquatic locomotion, occupied the middle tiers of Jurassic marine food webs. And the sharks, ancient and conservative in their basic body plan but constantly diversifying in their details, were present in Jurassic seas in considerable variety, though they would not produce their most spectacular forms until later in the Mesozoic. It is impossible to tell the story of Mesozoic apex predators without spending at least some time in the ancient freshwater environments of the period, because those environments produced one of the most remarkable large predators in the entire history of the planet. Sarcosuchus imperator, the flesh crocodile emperor, as its scientific name roughly translates, and that translation does not do it a disservice. Sarcosuchus lived during the early Cretaceous period, approximately 112 million years ago, in the river systems and lakes of what is now North Africa, specifically in the region that is today the Sahara Desert but was then a lush, tropical, river-dominated landscape teeming with life. The environment of early Cretaceous North Africa was rich in large prey, enormous fish, large turtles, and critically, dinosaurs that came to the rivers to drink or that waded through the shallows. All of these were potential prey for Sarcosuchus, and this enormous crocodilian was magnificently equipped to exploit all of them. The size of Sarcosuchus is the first thing that stops you cold. Based on fossil material that includes substantial skull material and a number of body osteoderms, the armored skin plates that crocodilians carry embedded in their skin, size estimates for adult Sarcosuchus center on approximately 9 to 10 meters in length and potential body masses of 8 to 10 metric tons. This is not a crocodilian. This is a land monster that happens to live in water. For comparison, the largest modern saltwater crocodiles, the largest living reptiles on Earth today, reach perhaps 6 meters in length and perhaps 1 metric ton in body mass. Sarcosuchus was perhaps 10 times as massive as the largest modern crocodile and potentially half again as long. The skull of Sarcosuchus was over 1.5 meters long, a massive, elongated structure bearing about 132 teeth in total, interlocking when the jaws closed to create an almost inescapable trap for anything caught in that bite. The nostrils of Sarcosuchus sat at the end of a distinctive, bulbous expansion at the tip of the snout, a structure called a bulla whose function is debated, but which may have been related to vocalization or sensory capabilities. The overall effect of all these features combined, the enormous size, the massive skull, the interlocking teeth, the armored body, was an animal of truly formidable predatory capability, the dominant predator of its freshwater ecosystems without any serious competition. Sarcosuchus likely hunted in the manner of modern large crocodilians, lurking in the shallows and at the water's edge, waiting with reptilian patience for prey to approach within striking distance, then exploding forward with the powerful stroke of its massive tail to seize its victim in those enormous jaws. Animals as large as medium-sized dinosaurs would not have been beyond its capabilities. Evidence of predation interactions between large crocodilians and dinosaurs is actually reasonably well documented in the fossil record of the Cretaceous, with dinosaur bones bearing crocodilian bite marks having been found at several sites around the world. Sarcosuchus, the largest of all known crocodilians, would have been capable of taking significantly larger dinosaur prey than its modern relatives, and in the river systems of early Cretaceous North Africa, it was unquestionably the supreme predator of its environment. While Sarcosuchus was ruling the rivers of North Africa, the rest of the Cretaceous world was producing its own extraordinary cast of predators, both on land and in the sea. The Cretaceous period, which lasted from approximately 145 to 66 million years ago, was in many respects the peak of Mesozoic biological diversity and ecological complexity. The world of the Cretaceous was warmer than today, sea levels were higher, shallow inland seas divided the major landmasses, and the diversity of life was extraordinary. On land, the great theropod dinosaurs had diversified into a remarkable range of predatory forms, from the small, feathered bird like Deinonychosaurs to the enormous carnosaurs and tyrannosaurids that represent the largest terrestrial predators of the entire Mesozoic. The tyrannosaurids, culminating in Tyrannosaurus rex, are of course the most famous, but they were relative latecomers to the Cretaceous story, dominating only the final 10 million years of the period, and only on the landmasses that correspond to modern North America and parts of Asia. In other parts of the Cretaceous world, different large theropod lineages held ecological sway. In what is now South America, the abelisaurids and carcharodontosaurids produced enormous predators like Giganotosaurus carolinii and Mapusaurus roseae. In Africa and other southern landmasses, similar carcharodontosaurid predators reached sizes that challenged and potentially exceeded even the largest tyrannosaurids. But for all the drama and spectacle of the Cretaceous terrestrial world, the most extreme ecological theater of the late Cretaceous was not on land but in the sea. The late Cretaceous oceans, warmer and higher than those of today, were occupied by an array of marine predators that collectively represent one of the most diverse and ecologically rich assemblages of large marine predators in Earth's entire history. The plesiosaurs continued to dominate, producing some of their largest forms in the Cretaceous. The marine turtles grew to enormous sizes, with forms like archelon reaching shell lengths of nearly 4 meters. The sharks diversified extensively. And into this already rich marine fauna came, during the Middle Cretaceous, a new group of marine predators that would rapidly come to dominate the late Cretaceous seas with a comprehensiveness that rivals any story of ecological takeover in the entire history of life: the mosasaurs. The mosasaurs were large, predatory marine lizards, most closely related to modern monitor lizards and the ancestor lineage of snakes, that evolved from terrestrial or semi-aquatic ancestors during the Middle Cretaceous and over tens of millions of years of evolution became increasingly specialized for life in the open ocean. They evolved a powerful, laterally compressed tail fin for propulsion, reduced their limbs to paddle like steering and stabilizing structures, elongated their bodies for hydrodynamic efficiency, and developed jaws of extraordinary capability for capturing and consuming large prey. By the late Cretaceous, mosasaurs had diversified into an extraordinary range of forms, from small, agile fish eaters to enormous, apex predators of the first order. The largest mosasaurs, forms like Tylosaurus proriger and Mosasaurus hoffmanni, reached estimated lengths of 12 to 14 meters or potentially larger, making them among the largest marine predators in Earth's history. Their skulls were adapted for a wide variety of prey, with some forms bearing robust, crushing teeth suited for hard-shelled prey like ammonites and turtles, while others had sharper, more recurved teeth suited for capturing fish and other vertebrates. A particularly remarkable feature of mosasaur skulls was the presence of a second row of teeth on the palate, on a bone called the pterygoid, that could help grip and move prey toward the throat after it had been seized by the main jaw teeth. This double row of teeth made escape from a mosasaur bite essentially impossible for any captured prey. The late Cretaceous seas, dominated by these enormous mosasaurs alongside large plesiosaurs, enormous sea turtles, and diverse shark faunas, represent one of the most ecologically spectacular marine environments in the entire history of Earth, a biological richness that would be swept away, along with the dinosaurs and so much else, by the catastrophic asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous period 66 million years ago. The Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, caused primarily by the impact of a large asteroid or comet with the Yucatan Peninsula of what is now Mexico 66 million years ago, is the most famous extinction event in Earth's history, primarily because it eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs and thereby created the ecological conditions that would eventually lead to the rise of large mammals and ultimately to ourselves. The impact released an amount of energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons simultaneously, triggering immediate catastrophic fires, global climate disruption, and most devastatingly, a prolonged period of reduced sunlight as debris and smoke filled the upper atmosphere and shut down photosynthesis across the planet. The consequences for food webs were catastrophic, with photosynthesis dramatically reduced for months to potentially years. The plants that formed the base of virtually every terrestrial food chain died off, and the animals that depended on those plants followed, and the predators that depended on those prey animals followed in turn. The toll of the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction was severe. Approximately 75% of all species on Earth were eliminated, including all non-avian dinosaurs, all mosasaurs, all non-avian pterosaurs, and the large majority of plesiosaurs. The marine world lost its dominant predators in a geological instant. The terrestrial world lost its dominant predators just as suddenly. And as with every extinction event before it, the aftermath of this catastrophe would create the conditions for the next great diversification, the next act in the long drama of predatory life on Earth. The world that emerged from the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction was a world dominated by the survivors. Birds, which were the avian dinosaurs and which would go on to produce some remarkable predatory forms of their own. The small mammals that had lived in the shadows of the dinosaurs for over 160 million years, and which would now, for the first time, have access to the full range of terrestrial ecological niches. And in the seas, the sharks and the rays, ancient and resilient, that had survived the extinction and would continue their long, successful evolutionary story. What came next is, in many ways, the strangest and most counterintuitive chapter in the history of life after the dinosaurs, because the world that rose from the ashes of the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction was, for a time, dominated not by the mammals or the birds that we might expect, but by creatures that challenge everything we think we know about the post-dinosaur world. In the immediate aftermath of the extinction, in the warm, humid forests that slowly reassembled themselves in the early Paleocene epoch of the Cenozoic era, approximately 66 to 56 million years ago, the ecological niches for large terrestrial predators were initially occupied not by mammals but by large reptiles, the crocodilians and the surviving lineages of large lizards, and eventually and most remarkably by birds. Specifically by a group of large, flightless birds that represent one of the most surprising evolutionary stories in the entire post-Cretaceous world. But before we turn to the birds, we must address one of the most remarkable and most revealing biological discoveries of the past few decades: the giant snake Titanoboa cerugionensis, an animal that is simultaneously one of the most impressive predators in the post-dinosaur world and one of the most extraordinary geological clocks in the history of paleontology, capable of telling us things about the climate of the ancient world that no other fossil can quite match. Titanoboa cerugionensis was discovered in the Cerrejón coal mine in northern Colombia, South America, in fossil beds dating to approximately 58 to 60 million years ago, placing it in the early Paleocene epoch, very shortly after the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction. What was found in those mines was extraordinary, vertebrae of a snake of mind-bending size. Vertebrae so large that when the first specimens were discovered, the initial researchers who saw them assumed they must be turtle shell fragments or pieces of some other large animal, because surely no snake had ever grown this large. But the anatomy was unmistakable. These were snake vertebrae, and the animal they had belonged to was the largest snake that had ever lived on this planet. Titanoboa canadensis, based on the extensive fossil material eventually recovered from the Sarajan mine, reached estimated lengths of 12 to 15 meters, with some analyses suggesting that the largest individuals may have approached or exceeded 15 meters in total body length. The body mass estimates for this animal are equally staggering, with figures ranging from approximately 1,000 to over 1,100 kilograms, more than a metric ton of snake. For comparison, the largest modern anacondas, the largest living snakes by mass, typically reach about 5 to 6 meters in length and perhaps 250 kilograms in weight. Titanoboa was a snake that made a large anaconda look like a garden snake. It was an apex predator of its Paleocene South American environment, likely hunting large fish and early crocodilians in the river systems of a lush tropical forest, using the same constriction strategy that its modern relatives employ, but applied to prey of a size that nothing living today can challenge. But what makes Titanoboa truly extraordinary, beyond its sheer size, is what it tells us about the climate of the ancient world. The body size of snakes, and indeed of ectothermic animals generally, is strongly correlated with temperature. Warmer environments support larger ectothermic body sizes because metabolic rates in cold-blooded animals scale with ambient temperature, and a larger body size requires more metabolic output to maintain. By measuring the size of Titanoboa vertebrae and applying the known relationship between snake body size and environmental temperature, researchers have been able to extract a paleoclimate signal from this fossil snake, estimating the mean annual temperature of Paleocene South America at the time Titanoboa was alive. Their calculations suggest temperatures of approximately 30 to 34 degrees Celsius mean annual temperature, significantly warmer than the tropics of today, confirming independent geological evidence that the early Paleocene was a period of pronounced global warmth following the extinction event. Titanoboa is, therefore, simultaneously a biological marvel and a geological instrument, a creature whose extraordinary size encodes within its bones an archive of ancient climate data, a living thermometer frozen in stone across 60 million years of time. This is one of the most profound illustrations of a theme that runs through this entire story, that the great predators of the past are not merely creatures of biological interest in isolation, but are windows into the full complexity of the ancient worlds they inhabited, windows whose glass is made of bone and stone. While Titanoboa was ruling the rivers of Paleocene South America, the terrestrial world of the early Paleogene was undergoing its own remarkable ecological reorganization. The vacuum left by the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs was being filled by an assortment of new life forms, and among the most surprising of these were the large, flightless, predatory birds. We tend to think of birds as small, aerial creatures, the feathered inheritors of a modest corner of the Mesozoic world that survived the extinction by virtue of their small size and dietary flexibility. And in many respects, this is accurate. The birds that survived the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction were likely small, and their survival was probably facilitated by their ability to eat seeds and other food sources that persisted through the extinction crisis. But in the aftermath of the extinction, with the large predator niches of the terrestrial world suddenly and catastrophically empty, at least one lineage of birds made a remarkable evolutionary move. It gave up flight, grew dramatically larger, and became a terrestrial apex predator. The result was a group of birds collectively known as the gastornithids, and the most famous representative of this group, and the one that best illustrates the extraordinary ecological role these birds occupied, is Gastornis gigantea, sometimes also referred to by the older name Diatryma, a large, flightless bird that dominated the terrestrial ecosystems of what is now Europe during the Eocene epoch, approximately 56 to 34 million years ago. Gastornis was not a subtle animal. It stood approximately 1.5 to 2 meters tall, roughly the height of a tall adult human. It was massively built, with a muscular body, powerful legs designed for running and for delivering crushing kicks, and most memorably a beak of extraordinary size and robustness. A massive, deep, laterally compressed structure that, in profile, resembled nothing so much as an enormous hatchet blade attached to the front of the bird's skull. This beak was one of the most powerful structures in the avian skeleton, and its potential uses have been the subject of considerable debate among paleontologists. For many years, Gastornis was assumed to be a predator, the dominant apex hunter of Eocene European terrestrial ecosystems, a role that seemed consistent with its large size, its powerful legs, and above all that terrifying beak. The mental image of Gastornis as a predator, a 2-meter-tall bird with a beak capable of crushing bone, pursuing the small early mammals that populated Eocene forests, was certainly dramatic and biologically plausible. However, more recent research has complicated this picture. Analysis of the chemical composition of Gastornis bones, using calcium isotope ratios that can help distinguish between herbivores and carnivores in the fossil record, has suggested that Gastornis may actually have been primarily herbivorous, using that massive beak to crack hard-shelled seeds, nuts, and possibly tubers rather than to kill and dismember prey. This interpretation remains debated, and it is possible that Gastornis occupied a mixed dietary role, neither exclusively carnivore nor exclusively herbivore, exploiting whatever food sources were most available in its environment. What is clear is that regardless of its diet, Gastornis was the dominant large animal in Eocene European terrestrial ecosystems, occupying the ecological space that large mammals would eventually come to fill as the Cenozoic progressed. Because for all the biological interest of Gastornis and Titanoboa and the other remarkable creatures of the early Paleogene, the larger story of the Cenozoic era, the geological era that began with the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction and continues to the present day, is above all the story of the rise of mammals. The small, generalized survivors of the Mesozoic world were now, for the first time in over 160 million years, free to expand into the full range of ecological opportunities, and the evolutionary explosion that resulted was every bit as dramatic and creative as the Cambrian Explosion had been 500 million years earlier. Within 10 to 20 million years of the extinction, mammals had diversified into carnivores, herbivores, insectivores, and omnivores of every conceivable size and body plan. They had colonized forests, grasslands, rivers, and eventually the oceans, and they had produced apex predators of extraordinary capability. The story of mammalian predation in the Cenozoic is a long and rich one, full of creatures that are strange by modern standards, and yet recognizable in their ecological roles if not always in their biology. The early Cenozoic saw the dominance of a group of carnivorous mammals called the creodonts, which were not true carnivores in the modern sense, but were a separate evolutionary lineage of meat-eating mammals that achieved considerable diversity in size during the Eocene and Oligocene epochs. But the creodonts were eventually replaced by the true carnivorans, the evolutionary lineage that includes modern dogs, cats, bears, weasels, seals, and their relatives, and it is within the carnivorans that the most spectacular predatory mammals of the Cenozoic are found. To reach those spectacular predators, however, we need to first visit the seas, because while the land was being transformed by the radiation of mammals, the oceans were undergoing their own remarkable biological revolution, one that would produce some of the most impressive marine predators in the post-dinosaur world. The extinction of the mosasaurs and the large plesiosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous had left the role of apex marine predator open, and during the early Cenozoic, that role was initially filled to a significant degree by large, predatory fish and by the sharks that had survived the extinction. But as the Cenozoic progressed and mammals diversified on land, some mammalian lineages made the transition back to the sea, embarking on evolutionary paths that would ultimately lead to the whales, dolphins, seals, and sea lions of the modern world. Among those transitional mammals and their descendants were some of the most awe-inspiring predators that the oceans of this planet have ever seen. The story of whale evolution is one of the most well-documented evolutionary transitions in the entire fossil record, a remarkable sequence that takes us from fully terrestrial, wolf-like ancestors called pachystids through a series of increasingly aquatic forms over a span of approximately 15 million years to the first fully aquatic whales of the Eocene epoch. Among those early whales, several lineages evolved into formidable predators, and none more so than Basilosaurus, a genus of early Eocene whale that reached lengths of 15 to 20 meters and was without question the apex marine predator of its time. Basilosaurus, despite its misleading name, which means king lizard and reflects the initial mistaken identification of its remains as a marine reptile, was fully and unambiguously a mammal, and it was a fearsome one. It had a long, serpentine body unlike that of any modern whale, and relatively small vestigial hind limbs that projected from the rear of its body, biological souvenirs of its terrestrial ancestry that were no longer functional for locomotion, but which may have played a role in mating behavior. Its skull bore heterodont dentition, teeth of different shapes for different purposes, including massive, interlocking cheek teeth that could crush and shear with enormous force, and sharp, recurved front teeth for seizing prey. Everything about its skull architecture speaks to a predator capable of taking large prey, and evidence from fossil sites in Egypt, where Basilosaurus remains have been found in association with the remains of smaller whales and other large marine animals bearing Basilosaurus bite marks, confirms that this was indeed a predator of large vertebrate prey. Basilosaurus ruled the warm, shallow Eocene seas for millions of years, a mammalian leviathan that filled the apex marine predator role left vacant by the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs of the Cretaceous, and did so with the characteristic efficiency and power of the cetacean lineage that would go on to produce the largest animals this planet has ever seen. As we move through the Oligocene and into the Miocene epoch, the Cenozoic world becomes progressively more recognizable, the continents approaching their modern configurations, the climate cooling from the extreme warmth of the early Paleogene toward the cooler conditions that culminated in the Pleistocene ice ages. And it is during this period of progressive cooling and ecological change that the grasslands of the world expanded dramatically, driven by the changing climate, creating vast new ecological theaters of open savanna and prairie that in turn drove the evolution of new predator and prey communities. The expansion of grasslands created enormous herds of large, grazing mammals, horses, rhinos, elephants, and the diverse array of bovids and deer that came to dominate Miocene and Pliocene terrestrial ecosystems. And where there are enormous herds of large prey animals, there will be predators evolved to exploit them. The Miocene and Pliocene produced an extraordinary diversity of large carnivorous mammals, including the most spectacular and most diverse radiation of saber-toothed predators in the history of life. Saber-toothed predators, defined by their possession of greatly elongated blade-like upper canine teeth, evolved independently in multiple mammalian lineages during the Cenozoic, representing a remarkable example of convergent evolution, the repeated independent arrival at the same solution to the same ecological problem by different evolutionary lineages. This repeated independent evolution of the saber-tooth condition speaks to the effectiveness of elongated, blade-like canines as hunting tools against large prey, because evolution rarely preserves a structure that is not functionally effective. The saber-tooth condition appears to have been particularly useful for dispatching large, thick-skinned prey quickly, with a single devastating bite to the throat or other vulnerable area, a killing strategy that minimized the risk to the predator from the struggling of large, dangerous prey. The most famous of all the saber-toothed predators, and the one that will carry us into our exploration of the Ice Age megafauna, is Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, whose remains have been found in extraordinary abundance and diversity in the tar pits of what is now Southern California, but whose geographic range extended across the Americas. But before we arrive at Smilodon and the Ice Age world that produced it, we need to acknowledge that Smilodon was only one player in a much larger ecosystem, one populated by giants of every description, herbivores and predators alike, that represent perhaps the most spectacular assemblage of large land mammals in the history of the Cenozoic. The Pleistocene epoch, which lasted from approximately 2.5 million to 11,000 years ago, was a time of repeated glacial cycles, periods of dramatic global cooling during which massive ice sheets expanded from the polar regions to cover large portions of the northern landmasses, followed by warmer interglacial periods during which the ice retreated. These glacial cycles created dramatic environmental oscillations that drove evolutionary change and ecological reshuffling, and they created the Ice Age world of the megafauna, a world populated by animals of extraordinary size. The Pleistocene Ice Age world was, in terms of large animal diversity and abundance, richer than anything seen on Earth since the height of the Mesozoic. On every major continent, enormous mammals dominated the landscape: woolly mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths reaching the size of modern elephants, enormous rhinos, giant bison, oversized camels, and in the cave systems and open tundras of Europe and Asia, the cave lion and cave hyena, enlarged versions of their modern relatives adapted to the cold and the enormous prey available in their environments. Hunting this extraordinary megafauna were a similarly extraordinary array of large predators. And among the most remarkable of these Ice Age hunters was an animal that tends to be overshadowed by the more famous Smilodon, but which deserves recognition in its own right: formidable predators of the Pleistocene world, Arctodus simus, the short-faced bear. Arctodus simus is arguably the largest terrestrial mammalian predator that has ever existed, at least in terms of overall body mass, challenging even some of the largest carnivorous dinosaurs for that distinction. The largest individuals of this remarkable bear reached estimated body masses of somewhere between 800 kilograms and over a metric ton, with some outlier estimates pushing even higher. Standing on all fours, Arctodus would have reached nearly 2 meters at the shoulder. Standing upright on its hind legs, it would have towered to over 3.5 meters, capable of looking directly at structures nearly 12 feet above the ground. It was, in every physical sense, a creature of overwhelming power. The lifestyle and predatory behavior of Arctodus simus have been subjects of considerable debate among paleontologists. Its common name, the short-faced bear, refers to its distinctive skull proportions. The face of Arctodus was shorter and more domed than that of modern bears, with large, forward-facing orbits that gave it excellent binocular vision, and the jaw and tooth structure of this animal has been analyzed repeatedly in attempts to determine whether it was primarily a predator, primarily a scavenger of large carcasses, or perhaps a hypercarnivore capable of both. The limb proportions of Arctodus, long-legged and built for speed relative to other bears, suggest that it was capable of faster sustained locomotion than modern bears, which fits a model of either active pursuit predation or rapid movement between widely spaced food sources in a vast landscape. The evidence of stable isotope analysis of Arctodus bones, which can reveal information about diet through the chemical signatures left by different types of food, has generally supported the hypothesis that Arctodus was a hypercarnivore, subsisting on a diet heavily dominated by meat, whether obtained through active hunting or through the displacement of other predators from their kills or both. An animal of Arctodus's size and strength would have been capable of displacing virtually any other predator of the Pleistocene world from a kill, including packs of dire wolves, including the great saber-toothed cats, possibly even including cave bears in the shared landscapes of the late Pleistocene. Arctodus simus, in its world, may well have been the supreme terrestrial mammalian predator, a creature before which even Smilodon would have had reason to hesitate. And yet, for all its power, for all its size, for all the millions of years of evolutionary refinement that had produced it, Arctodus simus was gone from the world by approximately 11,000 years ago, one of the many remarkable predators that vanished in the wave of extinctions that swept through the Ice Age megafauna at the end of the Pleistocene. The precise causes of these end Pleistocene extinctions remain debated, but the consensus among researchers increasingly points to the combined effects of climate change, as the last glacial maximum gave way to the warmer Holocene, and the hunting pressure of an expanding and increasingly sophisticated human population whose members had, by the late Pleistocene, become extraordinarily efficient large-game hunters. The loss of Arctodus simus, of Smilodon, of the woolly mammoth, of the giant ground sloth, and of dozens of other remarkable large animals in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene represents the most recent chapter in the long story of apex predator extinction that we have been following throughout this account. And it reminds us, as every chapter of this story has reminded us in different ways, that dominance, however complete it may appear, however long it may have lasted, is always and everywhere temporary. The world changes, the climate shifts, prey populations crash, competitors arrive. And the greatest predators that have ever walked or swum or flown across this planet are reduced to bones in the earth, waiting for curious minds to find them and ask the questions that bring their stories back to life. This has been part one of our exploration of the forgotten apex predators of Earth's ancient history. We have traveled from the Cambrian seas 500 million years ago through the explosion of complex life, through the age of great fish and armored giants, through the rise of the first mammal-like predators and their near-total annihilation in the Great Dying, through the reign of crocodilian leviathans and marine reptile colossi, through the post-dinosaur world of giant snakes and remarkable birds, and to the edge of the Ice Age and the spectacular predators that ruled that frozen, magnificent world. In Part 2, we will continue this journey, exploring the final chapters of the megafaunal story, the specific survival strategies and biological innovations that define the greatest predators of the Ice Age, and the sobering final act of this long drama as we examine what happens when a top predator loses the very specific ecological conditions on which its existence depends. The story continues, and it does not end tidily. There is something that happens when you stand in a museum and look at the reconstructed skeleton of an extinct predator. Something shifts in your understanding of the world, quietly and irrevocably, like a geological fault line settling into a new position deep underground. You look at those bones arranged with such careful scholarship into the posture of a living animal, and you understand intellectually that this creature was real, that it breathed and hunted and killed and eventually died, that its existence was not a story or a myth or an abstraction, but a physical fact inscribed in the rock of this planet. And yet the full weight of that reality is almost impossible to truly absorb, because the creature before you is so far outside the boundaries of your lived experience, so thoroughly removed from the living world you inhabit, that your mind keeps sliding off it, keeps retreating to the comfortable, familiar categories of the present rather than truly inhabiting the deep strangeness of the past. What we are attempting to do in this documentary, and what we continue in this second part of our exploration, is to bridge that gap as completely and as honestly as the available evidence allows. We are trying to look at these vanished creatures not merely as curiosities of the fossil record, but as real animals, as living ecological entities whose existence was shaped by specific environmental conditions, whose predatory strategies were refined by millions of years of evolutionary pressure, whose dominance was genuine and whose extinction was consequential. And we are trying to understand, above all, what the long sequence of their rises and falls tells us about the nature of life on this planet, about the relationship between biological complexity and environmental stability, and about the ultimately provisional character of any claim to ecological supremacy. We left part 1 at the edge of the Ice Age, with the great megafaunal predators of the Pleistocene beginning to make their appearance. Now we go deeper into that world, and we follow the story all the way to its most recent chapters, to extinctions so close in time that they overlap with the boundaries of human history, to predators so recently vanished that their memory lingers in the myths and stories of the cultures that witnessed their disappearance. This is the final act of the drama we have been watching unfold across 500 million years, and it is, in many ways, the most instructive act of all. To fully understand the Ice Age predators and what their extinction means, we first need to understand the Ice Age world itself, not the Ice Age as a monolithic event, but as the extraordinarily dynamic, oscillating environmental reality that it actually was. The Pleistocene epoch, spanning roughly 2.5 million to 11,000 years ago, was characterized not by a single, sustained period of cold, but by a series of glacial and interglacial cycles, repeated swings between cold, glaciated conditions and warmer, more temperate conditions, driven by predictable variations in Earth's orbit around the Sun, variations described mathematically by the Milankovitch cycles. During glacial maxima, the coldest peaks of these cycles, enormous ice sheets several kilometers thick covered the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere, locking up enormous quantities of water and dropping global sea levels by over 100 meters. The exposed continental shelves created land bridges between landmasses that are today separated by ocean, most famously the Bering Land Bridge that connected the landmass of what is now Asia to the landmass of what is now Alaska, allowing the exchange of animal populations between continents that had been separated for millions of years. These exchanges had profound consequences for the ecology and evolution of the animals involved, creating new competitive interactions, new predator-prey relationships, and new opportunities for evolutionary diversification. Between glacial maxima, during the warmer interglacial periods, the ice retreated, sea levels rose, the land bridges were submerged, and the climate of the unglaciated portions of the world was often significantly warmer and wetter than the glacial periods, creating rich, productive environments capable of supporting very large populations of very large animals. The Pleistocene megafauna, the extraordinary assemblage of giant mammals that characterized the Ice Age world, thrived particularly during these warmer interglacial periods and the relatively mild intervals between them, when productive grasslands, savannas, and mixed woodland grassland environments provided abundant food for large herbivores, and those abundant large herbivores in turn supported large and diverse predator communities. The environmental backdrop of the Pleistocene was, therefore, one of constant change, of repeated cycles of expansion and contraction, of shifting habitats and changing food resources, of new neighbors arriving via land bridges and old neighbors disappearing as conditions changed. For the large predators of the Pleistocene world, this constant environmental flux was both an opportunity and a challenge. Opportunity in the form of abundant prey and diverse ecological theaters to exploit, challenge in the form of a world that never stayed the same long enough to settle into a truly stable equilibrium. Into this dynamic world, let us now return to Smilodon, the most famous of all the saber-toothed predators, and examine it with the full depth of attention that its remarkable biology deserves. Smilodon is known to us from extraordinarily rich fossil material, particularly from the asphalt seeps of the La Brea deposits, where thousands of individuals of multiple species have been preserved in remarkable detail, giving us an unusually complete picture of the animal's anatomy, its growth, its pathology, and something of its social behavior. The genus Smilodon actually encompasses 3 species of varying sizes, ranging from the relatively modest Smilodon gracilis through the medium-sized Smilodon fatalis to the truly enormous Smilodon populator, the largest of the 3 and one of the largest cat-like predators in the history of mammalian life. Smilodon populator, which inhabited South America during the Pleistocene, reached estimated body masses of perhaps 280 kilograms at the upper end, and some estimates push even higher, making the largest individuals comparable in mass to a modern male lion but built very differently, with a more massively muscled upper body and forelimbs, a shorter, more compact lower body and hind limbs, and of course those extraordinary saber canine teeth, which in the largest individuals reached lengths of 28 centimeters or more along their outer curve. The functional morphology of the Smilodon saber teeth has been one of the most intensively studied questions in vertebrate paleontology, and it has generated debates that continue to the present day. The key challenge is this: those enormous canines were powerful weapons, but they were also fragile in certain respects, being prone to breakage if subjected to the lateral twisting forces that would result from a struggling prey animal, and the jaw mechanics of Smilodon required a very specific killing bite to use them effectively without risking damage. The lower jaw of Smilodon could depress to an extraordinary angle, perhaps over 90 degrees, allowing the full deployment of the upper canines, but this same extreme jaw gape necessarily meant that the jaw-closing muscles were operating at a mechanical disadvantage when the mouth was open widest, generating less force than one might expect given the animal's overall musculature. The resolution to this apparent paradox has been approached from multiple directions by different research teams. One influential hypothesis suggests that Smilodon used its massive forelimbs, among the most powerfully built of any known felid, to wrestle large prey to the ground and hold it in a position that minimized struggling before delivering a precise, controlled killing bite to the soft tissues of the throat, targeting the jugular veins and carotid arteries in a way that would cause rapid blood loss and death, without requiring the animal to bite through bone or risk the lateral forces that could damage the canines. This hunting strategy would have required considerable strength, great precision, and possibly cooperative hunting behavior to be most effective against the largest prey, and the prey that Smilodon targeted was, by any measure, formidable. The Pleistocene ecosystems in which Smilodon lived were populated by bison, horses, camels, tapirs, giant ground sloths, young mammoths and mastodons, and a variety of other large herbivores, any of which represented a dangerous and challenging hunting target. The fossil record from La Brea includes numerous Smilodon specimens with healed injuries, broken bones that had knit back together during the animal's lifetime, dislocated joints, and other evidence of the physical trauma that came with regularly engaging large, dangerous prey. Some of these healed injuries are so debilitating that the animals bearing them could not have survived without assistance, without other members of their social group providing food and protection during their recovery, which represents compelling indirect evidence that Smilodon was indeed a social animal, hunting and living in groups rather than as a solitary predator. The social behavior hypothesis for Smilodon is supported by other lines of evidence as well. The abundance of Smilodon individuals at La Brea, relative to other carnivores found there, is consistent with a social species that lived in groups. The size and robustness of the saber teeth themselves may have had a social signaling function in addition to their hunting utility, with larger canines advertising individual quality to potential mates or rivals. And the complexity of the hunting strategy required to successfully bring down large, dangerous prey with specialized killing weapons that require careful deployment argues for the kind of coordinated group behavior that would be facilitated by social living. All of this paints a picture of Smilodon as an animal of genuine sophistication, not simply a brute force killing machine, but a highly evolved predator whose hunting success depended on strength, precision, cooperation, and social intelligence. It was, in its own Pleistocene context, the culmination of millions of years of felid evolution, finely tuned to exploit the specific prey base of its time and place with extraordinary effectiveness. And its extinction, when it came, was not the result of any failure of its predatory capabilities. It was the result of the collapse of the prey base on which those capabilities depended, a theme we will return to repeatedly as we work our way toward the end of this story. Let us now look at another dimension of the Ice Age predator story, one that tends to be overlooked in favor of the more dramatic mammalian carnivores. The role of the large, predatory birds of the Pleistocene world, and specifically the extraordinary story of the terror birds, the Phorusrhacids, a family of large, flightless, predatory birds that dominated the terrestrial predator niche in South America for an extraordinarily long period, and that represent one of the most remarkable evolutionary stories in the entire Cenozoic era. The Phorusrhacids, whose informal common name of terror birds was bestowed by scientists and science communicators, who evidently found the more formal taxonomic label insufficient to convey the appropriate level of alarm, evolved in South America during the Eocene epoch and maintained ecological dominance of that continent's large predator niche for an astonishing span of time. South America's Cenozoic era was an isolated island continent, separated from North America by a seaway and therefore cut off from the interchange of fauna that characterized the connected landmasses of the Northern Hemisphere. In this isolation, South American evolution followed its own distinct trajectory, producing life forms found nowhere else on Earth, and among those distinctive life forms, the Phorusrhacids were among the most extraordinary. The Phorusrhacids ranged in size from modest forms about the size of a large modern eagle to enormous species that stood 2.5 to 3 meters tall, substantially taller than a large man and considerably more dangerous. The largest species, forms like Kellenc and Guillermoy, whose skull alone measured 72 centimeters in length and which stood an estimated 3 meters tall, were among the largest birds that have ever existed, comparable in overall size to the largest of the moa, though very different in their ecology and biology. The skull of a large Phorusrhacid was a remarkable weapon. The massive, hooked beak was capable of delivering powerful, axe-like downward blows to prey, a killing strategy that may have involved stunning or killing smaller prey with rapid, repeated strikes rather than the prolonged struggle of a mammalian predator wrestling with its victim. The legs of the Phorusrhacids were long and powerful, built for speed. An analysis of their limb proportions suggests that the larger species were capable of running at speeds that have been estimated at anywhere from 40 to perhaps 70 kilometers per hour in short sprints, making them rapid pursuit predators capable of running down most of the prey animals available in their environments. They hunted the native South American mammals, a fauna of remarkable endemism that included large native ungulates, armadillo relatives, enormous rodents, and a variety of other mammals found nowhere else on Earth. The reign of the Phorusrhacids in South America lasted from the Eocene into the Pleistocene, a span of approximately 50 million years, making it one of the longest sustained periods of ecological dominance by any single predator lineage in the history of terrestrial vertebrates. Their eventual decline came not primarily from an extinction event in the traditional sense, but from the Great American Biotic Interchange, the faunal exchange that occurred when the Isthmus of Panama rose from the sea approximately 3 million years ago, connecting North and South America for the first time in tens of millions of years, and allowing the large mammalian predators of North America, specifically the ancestral lineages that would give rise to modern jaguars, pumas, and other felids, to flood southward into what had previously been the exclusive domain of the terror birds. In the face of competition from these new, highly efficient mammalian predators, the Phorusrhacids declined and eventually disappeared, the last of their kind vanishing from the fossil record in the early Pleistocene. Their story is a remarkable one on multiple levels, for the extraordinary length of their dominance, for the evolutionary creativity of a bird lineage that filled the apex predator niche so completely and for so long, and for the manner of their eventual fall, displaced not by an asteroid or a volcanic catastrophe, but by the simple arrival of competitors from a previously isolated landmass. It is, in miniature, a version of the broader story of predator displacement and replacement that runs throughout the entire history of life on this planet. While the phorusrhacids were making their long last stand in South America, the rest of the Pleistocene world was producing its own extraordinary cast of predators, and we need to spend some time with several of them that have not yet received the attention they deserve in this account. Among the most impressive and most biologically fascinating of the non-Smilodon large predators of the Pleistocene world is the dire wolf, Oenocyon durus, an animal that has become enormously famous in popular culture in recent years, but which is, in the specifics of its biology and ecology, somewhat different from how it is typically portrayed. The dire wolf was real. It was not merely a mythological construct or a fictional elaboration of the more familiar modern gray wolf, but an actual species with a fossil record of extraordinary richness, known from thousands of specimens collected from fossil sites across the Americas, with the La Brea tar pits again providing the most spectacular single-site collection. In terms of raw body size, the dire wolf was not dramatically larger than the largest modern gray wolves, with body mass estimates typically centering around 68 kilograms for average individuals, somewhat heavier and more robustly built than a large modern wolf, but not the towering giant of popular imagination. What made the dire wolf extraordinary was not its size, but its specialization. The skull and tooth anatomy of the dire wolf shows a significantly more robust construction than that of the gray wolf, with proportionally larger, heavier teeth and a jaw structure built for generating and withstanding greater bite forces. This anatomy is consistent with an animal that regularly fed on the bones of large prey, extracting the nutritious marrow from the bones of the enormous Pleistocene megafauna that constituted its prey base. Stable isotope analysis of dire wolf bones has confirmed a diet heavily based on large herbivores, and the species was clearly a pack hunter, as evidenced by its social ecology and the physical demands of hunting animals like bison, horses, and ground sloths that would have been impossible to subdue alone. The dire wolf and the gray wolf coexisted in the Americas during much of the late Pleistocene, occupying overlapping but not identical ecological roles, with the dire wolf apparently more specialized for the large megafauna prey and the gray wolf somewhat more flexible in its dietary habits. When the megafaunal extinction swept through the Pleistocene fauna at the end of the epoch, the dire wolf, with its extreme specialization for large prey, was eliminated, while the more generalist gray wolf survived, adapting to the smaller prey base of the post-megafaunal world. It is yet another example of the pattern that runs through this entire story. That extreme ecological specialization, while it enables extraordinary efficiency in exploiting a specific resource, creates a corresponding vulnerability when that resource disappears. The Pleistocene megafaunal extinction, which unfolded broadly between approximately 50,000 and 4,000 years ago, with different regions experiencing their losses at different times, is one of the most consequential and most debated events in the recent history of life on this planet. The scale of the extinction was remarkable. Across the world, the majority of large animal species, those weighing more than 44 kilograms, and particularly those weighing more than a metric ton, disappeared within this relatively brief window of time. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, woolly rhinos, cave lions, Smilodon, the dire wolf, giant ground sloths, the glyptodon and its armadillo-like relatives, the enormous short-faced bear Arctodus simus, the giant deer Megaloceros with its extraordinary palmate antlers spanning nearly 4 meters, the cave hyena, and dozens of other remarkable animals all vanished, leaving the world's large animal communities looking dramatically impoverished by comparison to what had existed before. The cause of this extinction has been the subject of intense research and sometimes heated debate for decades. Two primary hypotheses have dominated the discussion: climate change, specifically the dramatic environmental shifts associated with the transition from the last glacial maximum to the warmer Holocene epoch, and human hunting pressure, sometimes called the overkill hypothesis, which posits that expanding human populations of skilled hunters were primarily responsible for the collapse of megafaunal populations. Most researchers today favor some version of a combined hypothesis, acknowledging that both climate change and human hunting pressure contributed to the extinctions, with the relative importance of each factor varying by region and by species. The climate change component of the argument is straightforward in its broad outline. The end of the last glacial period saw dramatic and relatively rapid shifts in vegetation and habitat, with grasslands giving way to forests in many regions, with the habitats that had supported enormous herds of large grazers being transformed into environments that could support fewer and smaller animals. For species already stressed by these environmental changes, even modest additional mortality pressure from human hunting could push populations past the tipping point of recovery into the irreversible downward spiral of extinction. The human hunting pressure component is supported by a pattern that is consistent across multiple continents and island groups. The timing of megafaunal extinctions consistently correlates with the arrival of human populations, typically within a few thousand years of the first evidence of human presence in a region. This pattern holds in Australia, where the megafaunal extinction occurred approximately 50,000 years ago, coinciding with the arrival of the first humans on that continent. It holds in the Americas, where the extinction was concentrated in the period 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, shortly after the first entry of human populations from the north. And it holds in island settings around the world, where megafaunal extinctions are consistently associated with the arrival of the first human settlers. The combination of these lines of evidence paints a picture of human populations as a significant and perhaps decisive driver of the end Pleistocene megafaunal extinction, acting in concert with climate change to eliminate animals that had survived many previous glacial-interglacial cycles, but that had never before faced the combination of environmental disruption and sustained, skilled human predation simultaneously. The end of the Pleistocene megafauna was not merely an ecological event. It was a transformation of the biological landscape so profound that its consequences shaped the world we inhabit today. The ecosystems we consider natural, the African savanna with its elephants, lions, and wildebeest, the northern forests and tundras with their moose and wolves and bears, the South American pampas with their pumas and guanacos, these are all impoverished versions of what those ecosystems looked like before the megafaunal extinction. They are ecosystems that are missing most of their largest species, communities that have not fully recovered from the loss of the megafauna and may never fully do so, because the evolutionary timescales required to produce new large-bodied species are vastly longer than the few thousand years that have elapsed since the extinctions. Understanding this context matters deeply for understanding the final chapter of the story we are telling, the story of the very most recent apex predator extinctions, events so recent that some of them overlap with written historical records, events so recent that the bones of the vanished predators have not yet fully fossilized in many cases, events so recent that the ecological wounds they represent are still fresh and still visible in the landscapes they left behind. We turn now to one of the most remarkable and most instructive examples of apex predator ecology and extinction in the entire 500-million-year story we have been telling. The story of Haast's eagle, Hieraatis murray, a bird that occupied a unique and extraordinary ecological position in an equally unique and extraordinary island ecosystem, and whose extinction illustrates with brutal clarity the degree to which the existence of a specialized apex predator is tied to the existence of the specific prey base that sustains it. New Zealand is one of the most extraordinary places on Earth from a biogeographical perspective. It is a group of islands that separated from the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana approximately 80 million years ago, carrying with it only a limited selection of the fauna that was present at the time of separation. Because New Zealand separated before the evolution of modern mammals, and because its isolation in the South Pacific prevented the subsequent colonization by mammalian fauna that occurred on most other landmasses, New Zealand developed as a world apart, an ecosystem built almost entirely from birds, reptiles, and invertebrates, without the large terrestrial mammals that dominated ecosystems elsewhere in the world. In the absence of large terrestrial mammals, certain bird lineages in New Zealand evolved to fill the ecological roles that mammals occupied elsewhere. Most spectacularly, the moa, a group of large, flightless birds belonging to the ratite lineage, diversified into approximately 9 species ranging in size from turkey-sized animals to the enormous South Island giant moa, Dinornis robustus, females of which could stand up to 3.5 meters tall and weigh up to 250 kilograms, making them the largest birds that have existed on Earth in the relatively recent past. The moa were the dominant large herbivores of New Zealand, browsing on the native vegetation with long necks and robust beaks adapted to different plant types at different heights, occupying the ecological roles that deer, antelope, or large rodents might have played in an equivalent continental ecosystem. and where there are large, abundant prey animals, evolution will inevitably produce a predator capable of exploiting them. In New Zealand, that predator was Haast's eagle. Hieraaetus murray evolved from a small eagle ancestor, likely a species that arrived in New Zealand relatively recently in geological terms, perhaps 1 to 2 million years ago, from Australia. Once established in New Zealand, in an environment with no mammalian predators and with abundant large prey in the form of the moa, the evolutionary pressures on this eagle were extraordinary and unidirectional. Get bigger, get stronger, get more powerful, because bigger means more access to the most abundant and most calorie-rich prey in the environment. The result of this evolutionary pressure was staggering. Haast's eagle became, by a significant margin, the largest eagle that has ever lived. Female Haast's eagles, which were substantially larger than males as is typical in raptors, reached body masses estimated at somewhere between 10 and 15 kilograms, with some estimates pushing to the upper end of this range. Their wingspan reached approximately 2.5 to 3 meters, and their talons, the primary weapons of an eagle, were proportionally enormous, comparable in size to the claws of a modern tiger. These were not the delicate precision instruments of a bird hawk, evolved to snatch small prey from open ground. These were weapons designed for one purpose: to seize, penetrate, and incapacitate large birds that could weigh many times the eagle's own body mass. The hunting strategy of Haast's eagle, reconstructed from its anatomy and from the evidence preserved in the bones of its moa prey, was one of the most specialized and most dramatic predatory approaches in the entire history of avian life. Haast's eagle was built for the forests of New Zealand, with relatively short wings for its body size, an adaptation for maneuvering through dense woodland rather than soaring in open country. It was an ambush predator, likely approaching prey from above and behind, dropping from a perch or a low flight path to strike with those enormous talons at extremely high velocity. Analysis of moa bones bearing Haast's eagle talon marks shows that the eagle's feet, striking at speeds estimated to be perhaps 80 kilometers per hour or more, were capable of penetrating the pelvic bones of even large moa, delivering a strike of such force and precision that the prey was likely immobilized or killed near instantaneously. Moa bones bearing the distinctive talon punctures and scratches of Haast's eagle have been found at multiple sites across New Zealand, confirming predation interactions between the two species. Some of these moa specimens are very large individuals, demonstrating that even the largest moa were not beyond the predatory reach of this remarkable bird. Haast's eagle was, in its island ecosystem, what the lion or the tiger is in continental systems. The unchallenged apex predator, the dominant force shaping the behavior and evolution of the prey community, feared and avoided by the animals it hunted to a degree that would have shaped every behavioral choice those animals made about where to feed, when to move, and how to respond to the sounds and shadows of the forest. The ecological relationship between Haast's eagle and the moa was a stable one, having persisted for hundreds of thousands of years without significant disruption. The eagle population was regulated by the availability of moa prey, and the moa population was regulated in part by eagle predation, creating the kind of predator-prey equilibrium that characterizes healthy, intact ecosystems. New Zealand, in the absence of human presence, was a world in which this extraordinary avian drama played out in the deep forests and along the coastal lowlands of the islands, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, in a biological stability that seemed, from within the system, as if it might last forever. It did not last forever. It lasted only until the arrival of the first Polynesian settlers in New Zealand, now dated through archaeological and genetic evidence to approximately 700 years ago, in the late 13th century of the Common Era. This makes New Zealand one of the last significant landmasses on Earth to experience human colonization, and the consequences of that colonization for the native fauna were swift, severe, and in many cases permanent. The Polynesian settlers who arrived in New Zealand, the ancestors of the Maori people, were skilled navigators, experienced hunters, and agriculturalists who brought with them both the tools and the knowledge to exploit the resources of their new home aggressively. They encountered a fauna that had never experienced human hunting pressure, animals that had no evolutionary history of fear toward bipedal hunters with tools and weapons, animals that approached rather than fled from novel stimuli, animals that were, in the ecological terminology that biologists use today, naive prey. The moa, largest and most conspicuous of New Zealand's birds, were the most accessible and most rewarding targets for human hunters, providing large quantities of meat, eggs, feathers, and bone material for tools and ornaments. The hunting of moa by the first New Zealand settlers proceeded rapidly and systematically. Archaeological sites from this period contain enormous quantities of moa bones, evidence of sustained and large-scale hunting of these birds. Middens, ancient refuse deposits at settlement sites, have yielded the remains of hundreds and sometimes thousands of individual moa, representing a scale of exploitation that, applied to a population of large, slow-reproducing birds, was biologically unsustainable. Moa reproduced slowly. Like all large birds, they had long developmental periods, small clutch sizes, and late sexual maturity, meaning that their populations could not replace individuals lost to predation nearly as quickly as a skilled human hunting culture could remove them. The rate at which moa populations collapsed under this hunting pressure was, in geological terms, nearly instantaneous. Within approximately 100 to 200 years of the arrival of the first settlers, the moa populations had crashed so dramatically that the species were effectively extinct across most of their former range. By approximately 500 years ago, the moa were gone from New Zealand, all 9 species, the entire lineage, permanently erased from the living world by the sustained pressure of human hunting, in combination with habitat modification from burning and the introduction of the Pacific rat, which preyed on moa eggs and chicks. And with the moa went the eagle that depended on them. Haast's eagle had been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years toward a single ecological specialization, the hunting of large moa. It was superbly, magnificently adapted for that purpose and for that purpose alone. Its body size, its talon morphology, its wing shape, its ambush hunting strategy, every aspect of its biology was tuned to the exploitation of moa prey. When the moa disappeared, the eagle lost not merely its food source, but the entire ecological foundation on which its existence rested. There was nothing in New Zealand large enough to sustain a population of 15-kilogram eagles once the moa were gone. The eagle could not adapt to hunting smaller prey quickly enough, could not shrink its body to exploit new resources on the timescale of ecological collapse, could not survive in a world that no longer contained the animals for which it had been built. Haast's eagle was last definitively recorded alive, based on the dating of archaeological and paleontological specimens, approximately 600 years ago, though some researchers suggest remnant population in remote areas. Its extinction followed the extinction of its prey by no more than a few decades, perhaps less. The moa vanished, and the eagle followed them into oblivion with a swiftness that, even in the long context of 500 million years of predator extinctions we have been examining, is shocking in its totality and its speed. The story of Haast's eagle and the moa is the story of ecological dependency carried to its ultimate conclusion. It is the story of what happens when the thread that connects an apex predator to its world is cut. And it illustrates a principle that runs through every single example of predator extinction we have examined in this entire account, from Anomalocaris in the Cambrian seas to the forest racids of South America to Smilodon on the Pleistocene plains. The dominance of an apex predator is not an intrinsic property of the predator itself, but a relationship between the predator and the specific ecological conditions that sustain it. Change those conditions sufficiently, and the most formidable predator in the history of life is rendered as vulnerable as the smallest and most fragile of creatures. The lesson of Haast's eagle has a broader resonance that extends well beyond the specifics of New Zealand ecology, because the pattern of large predator vulnerability to prey-based collapse is not unique to island ecosystems or to the Pleistocene extinctions. It is a pattern that has repeated itself across the entire 500 million year history we have been examining, at every scale and in every context. The great Anomalocaris of the Cambrian were devastated when the marine ecosystems they depended on were disrupted by the end Ordovician glaciation. The magnificent Gorgonopsians of the Permian were eliminated when the Great Dying collapsed the terrestrial ecosystems that supported both them and their prey. The marine mosasaurs were wiped out when the asteroid impact of the end Cretaceous disrupted the marine food webs on which they depended. In every case, the mechanism is the same. The apex predator is the last link in a food chain, and when the chain is broken at any point below it, the predator is the most vulnerable member of the system. This vulnerability of apex predators is not merely of historical interest. It is one of the most important principles in contemporary ecology, informing our understanding of how modern ecosystems function and how they respond to disruption. Modern research has repeatedly demonstrated that the removal of apex predators from ecosystems, whether through direct human persecution, habitat loss, or prey base reduction, produces cascading consequences that ripple through the entire biological community in ways that are often surprising and counterintuitive. Ecologists have given a name to these cascading consequences, trophic cascades, and the study of trophic cascades in modern systems has provided some of the most powerful evidence for the ecological importance of apex predators as regulatory forces in their ecosystems. The classic examples of trophic cascades in the modern world are numerous and well documented. The removal of wolves from certain forested regions of the northern hemisphere led to explosions of deer populations, which in turn overgrazed riverside vegetation, destabilizing stream banks and fundamentally altering the physical structure of waterways. The reintroduction of wolves to those same systems produced a recovery of riparian vegetation and a restoration of stream bank stability, demonstrating that the influence of a single apex predator could extend all the way down to the physical geography of the landscape it inhabited. Similarly, the depletion of large sharks from certain marine ecosystems has led to explosions of their prey species, which in turn have severely impacted lower trophic levels in ways that fundamentally alter the character and productivity of entire marine ecosystems. These modern examples give us a window into the ecological consequences of the ancient predator losses we have been studying throughout this documentary. When the great plesiosaurids disappeared from the Jurassic seas, they left behind ecosystems in which the populations of large squid, fish, and other prey species were suddenly unregulated by their most powerful predator, with consequences that rippled through the entire marine food web. When the Roysuchids disappeared from the Triassic world, the populations of large herbivorous dinosaurs and other large prey animals were freed from their most significant source of predation pressure, contributing to the ecological opportunities that allowed the dinosaurs themselves to expand so dramatically in the subsequent Jurassic period. The history of life on Earth is, in a very real sense, the history of trophic cascades playing out across geological time. We have spent much of this documentary focusing on the large, charismatic apex predators that tend to dominate our imagination of prehistoric life. The giant sharks and plesiosaurs, the monstrous crocodilians, the saber-toothed cats, and the terror birds. But no account of the forgotten predators of Earth's history would be complete without acknowledging the remarkable diversity of smaller, but equally sophisticated predators that occupied the mid-tiers of ancient food webs, because it is often from these mid-tier predators that the next generation of apex predators evolved when the top of the food web was cleared by an extinction event. Throughout the history of life, it has been the medium-sized, ecologically flexible generalist predators that most consistently survived the major extinction events, not the highly specialized apex predators at the very top of their food webs. This is not coincidental but reflects a fundamental principle of extinction biology. Extreme specialization for a particular ecological role or prey type creates efficiency in normal times but vulnerability when conditions change. The generalists, with their broader dietary tolerances and their ability to exploit multiple food sources, have repeatedly proven more resilient than the specialists when the world is turned upside down. This principle played out with particular clarity in the aftermath of the Permian-Triassic extinction, the Great Dying, which we discussed in Part 1. Among the synapsids, the group that had been so dominant in the Permian, the animals that survived the extinction most successfully were not the magnificent Gorgonopsian apex predators, but rather a more modest and generalized group called the Dicynodonts, bulky herbivorous animals with a dietary flexibility that allowed them to survive on whatever plant material was available even in the impoverished early Triassic world. From such humble survivors, the eventual diversification of the mammal lineage would proceed over the subsequent 250 million years. Similarly, in the aftermath of the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, the animals that most successfully navigated the post-apocalyptic landscape of the early Paleogene were not the large, specialized predators and herbivores that had dominated the Cretaceous world, but the small, generalized, adaptable survivors. The small mammals with their flexible diets, the birds with their mobility and dietary versatility, the freshwater fish and turtles and crocodilians that could subsist on whatever the river systems provided during the long ecological recovery. From these survivors, the extraordinary Cenozoic radiation of mammals and birds would proceed, eventually producing the megafaunal world of the Pleistocene and all the remarkable predators we have been discussing. The pattern, therefore, is one of repeated collapse and reconstruction, of great predatory empires built by evolutionary specialization and destroyed by environmental catastrophe, of survivors rebuilding the biological world from the small and the flexible and the opportunistic, and of new empires of predatory life rising from those modest beginnings. It is a pattern that has repeated itself at least 5 times in the form of the major mass extinction events, and countless more times at the regional and ecosystem level, where smaller-scale disruptions have produced similar dynamics of collapse, survival, and reconstruction. As we approach the conclusion of this exploration, it is worth stepping back from the individual creatures and the specific ecological dramas we have been examining, and attempting to see the broader picture, to identify the principles and the patterns that emerge when you look at 500 million years of predatory life as a whole. The first and most fundamental pattern is one of contingency. The apex predators of any given moment in Earth's history were not the inevitable products of some directional evolutionary progress toward greater and greater biological perfection. They were instead the contingent products of their specific historical moments, organisms shaped by the particular combination of environmental conditions, available prey, evolutionary heritage, and competitive context that characterized their time and place. Change any element of that combination, and the outcome would have been different. If the Permian-Triassic extinction had not occurred, the synapsid lineage that produced the Gorgonopsians might have continued to dominate the terrestrial world indefinitely, and the dinosaurs might never have achieved the ecological prominence they are celebrated for. If the Cretaceous asteroid had missed Earth, the non-avian dinosaurs might still be here, and the large mammals that came after them, including our own lineage, might never have evolved. This contingency is not a depressing observation but a liberating one, because it reminds us that the history of life is not a predetermined narrative with a necessary outcome, but an open-ended process of evolutionary experimentation, full of branching paths and unexpected turns, in which the specific results we observe, including our own existence, are the product of a particular sequence of events rather than the inevitable conclusion of some biological destiny. The second major pattern is one of cyclical renewal. Despite the devastation of the 5 major mass extinctions and the countless smaller extinction events that punctuate the fossil record, life on Earth has always recovered. The recoveries have taken time, sometimes tens of millions of years, and the world that emerged from each recovery was different from the world that preceded it, shaped by new evolutionary trajectories and new ecological possibilities. But the recovery has always come. Life is, in this sense, extraordinarily resilient at the planetary scale, even as it is extraordinarily fragile at the level of individual species, populations, and ecosystems. The third pattern is one of complexity. The ecological systems that have produced and maintained apex predators throughout Earth's history are not simple hierarchies with a top predator controlling all below, but intricate webs of relationships, feedbacks, and dependencies that connect every member of the community to every other member in ways that are rarely fully visible or fully understood. The fate of an apex predator is bound up not just with the availability of its prey, but with the health of the plants that sustain that prey, with the chemical composition of the atmosphere and oceans, with the temperature and distribution of habitats, with the movements of continents and the activity of volcanoes. The apex predator is not the master of its world, but the most recent and most complex expression of it, and when the world changes beyond certain thresholds, even the most powerful creature that has ever lived becomes vulnerable to forces larger than itself. Let us now return one final time to the oceans, to close a circle that we opened at the very beginning of this story, when we first visited the Cambrian seas and the age of Anomalocaris. Because the oceans of Earth have maintained a continuous evolutionary history across all 500 million years of complex animal life, they represent the longest unbroken record of predator evolution and succession on the planet, and the marine predators of the last 50 million years provide some of the most spectacular examples of evolutionary innovation and ecological dominance in the entire history of life. We have already discussed the extraordinary diversity of Cretaceous marine predators, the mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, the marine crocodilians, and the diverse shark fauna of those ancient seas. In the aftermath of the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, the marine world was rebuilt by the survivors, and among those survivors, the sharks emerged as one of the dominant groups, having survived the extinction with less severe losses than the marine reptile groups. Through the Paleogene and Neogene, as the marine mammal lineages were diversifying and producing the whales, dolphins, and seals of the modern ocean, the sharks were also diversifying, producing an array of predatory forms ranging from the sleek pursuit predators to the massive, slow-moving giants that fed on large, calorie-rich prey. It is within this context of Cenozoic ocean evolution that we must place the most terrifying shark that has ever lived, an animal that has become one of the most culturally resonant of all prehistoric predators in the modern imagination, and whose actual biology and ecological impact fully justifies the fascination it inspires. Autodus megalodon, the megatoothed shark, known colloquially simply as megalodon. Megalodon was not a giant version of the modern great white shark, despite the popular representation of it as such. While it shared a broadly similar body plan with the great white, reflecting the fact that this body plan is highly effective for a large, active pursuit predator in the open ocean, Megalodon was more distantly related to the great white than is sometimes suggested, belonging to a separate evolutionary lineage of sharks called the Odontodontids that had a long and independent evolutionary history stretching back into the Cretaceous period. The teeth of Megalodon, which are known from fossil sites around the world and which can reach lengths of 18 centimeters or more along their diagonal, are structurally similar to but distinctly different from the teeth of a great white shark, and the body proportions of Megalodon, to the extent they can be reconstructed from the limited skeletal material available, were likely somewhat different as well. How large was Megalodon? This is the question that everyone asks, and the honest answer is that we do not know with precision, because shark skeletons are made largely of cartilage rather than bone and therefore rarely preserve as complete fossils. Our size estimates for Megalodon rely primarily on the scaling relationships between tooth size and body length that have been established in modern sharks, applied to the fossil teeth. These scaling relationships suggest body lengths for the largest Megalodon individuals of approximately 15 to 18 meters, with some analyses pushing toward 20 meters for exceptional individuals, and body mass estimates ranging from about 50 to 100 metric tons or more for the largest specimens. Even at the conservative end of these estimates, Megalodon was a predator of almost incomprehensible scale. A 15-meter, 50-metric-ton shark with teeth nearly as long as a human hand, hunting prey in the form of large whales, would have been the undisputed apex marine predator of its time, and the fossil record confirms this ecological role. Fossil whale bones bearing Megalodon bite marks have been found at multiple sites around the world, showing the characteristic paired score marks of the lateral edges of Megalodon teeth across ribs, vertebrae, and other large skeletal elements. Some of these whale bones show evidence of multiple bite attempts, suggesting that Megalodon's hunting strategy involved powerful, disabling bites to large prey, followed by waiting for the prey to weaken before feeding. Megalodon inhabited the world's oceans from approximately 23 million to approximately 3.5 million years ago, during the Miocene and Pliocene epochs, when the oceans were warmer than today, and supported large populations of the baleen whales, toothed whales, and large marine mammals that constituted its prey base. Its distribution was global, with fossil teeth found on every continent except Antarctica, reflecting an animal that ranged widely across the warm and temperate oceans of the world. The extinction of Megalodon, occurring approximately 3.5 to 3 million years ago, coincided with a period of significant global cooling and ocean temperature decline associated with the onset of the major northern hemisphere glaciations. This cooling had several consequences relevant to Megalodon's survival. It reduced the extent of the warm coastal and shallow oceanic environments that Megalodon apparently preferred for birthing and rearing young. It altered the distribution and abundance of the large whale prey that Megalodon depended on, and it may have facilitated the expansion and diversification of competing apex marine predators, including the ancestors of the modern killer whale. The combined effect of these changes appears to have been sufficient to tip Megalodon's populations into a decline from which they did not recover, extinguishing the largest shark that has ever lived and leaving the world's oceans without a comparable apex predator for the first time in tens of millions of years. The story of Megalodon raises a question that we have circled around throughout this entire account without fully addressing. What does the world lose when an apex predator disappears? We have discussed the ecological consequences of predator removal in terms of trophic cascades and prey population dynamics, but there is a deeper dimension to this question that deserves direct examination, because the loss of apex predators is not merely an ecological event, but also an informational event, a loss of biological knowledge accumulated over millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Each great predator we have discussed in this documentary represented the culmination of an extraordinary evolutionary investment. The saber teeth of Smilodon, the grasping frontal appendages of Anomalocaris, the crushing jaw of Dunkleosteus, the crushing bite force of Sarcosuchus, the jet-propelled striking power of Haast's eagle. These were not simple structures but extraordinarily complex biological mechanisms, refined over millions of generations of selection to a degree of functional sophistication that our most advanced engineering struggles to match. In each of these animals, evolution had, through the blind process of mutation, selection, and genetic drift operating over geological timescales, discovered solutions to predatory problems that represent some of the most elegant and effective biological engineering in the history of life. When these animals went extinct, that accumulated evolutionary information was lost permanently. The specific molecular and developmental instructions that encoded the precise geometry of a megalodon tooth, the exact neural architecture that coordinated the hunting behavior of Smilodon, the precise biomechanical relationships that gave Dunkleosteus its extraordinary bite, all of this vanished from the world as completely and as irreversibly as if it had never existed. The extinction of a species is not merely the death of individual animals, but the permanent erasure of a unique biological library, a library assembled over millions of years, and irreplaceable by any process operating on timescales relevant to human civilization. This is not simply a philosophical observation. The study of extinct predators and their biological innovations has repeatedly provided insights of genuine scientific value, from the understanding of fluid dynamics gleaned from the study of extinct marine reptile body forms, to the insights into bone mechanics derived from the analysis of giant dinosaur limbs, to the understanding of prey-predator coevolution that emerges from the study of ancient arms races between predators and armored prey. The bones of the forgotten titans are not merely historical curiosities, but scientific resources of ongoing value, archives of biological information that continue to yield new insights as our analytical tools improve and our questions become more sophisticated. It is this aspect of the story, the informational dimension of the fossil record, that brings us to what may be the most important and most humbling conclusion of this entire exploration. What we know about the ancient predators of this planet, as extraordinary and as rich as that knowledge is, represents only the tiniest fraction of what there is to know. The fossil record is an extraordinarily incomplete archive of the history of life. Only a small fraction of all organisms that have ever lived were preserved as fossils, and of those that were preserved, only a fraction have been found, and of those that have been found, only a fraction have been studied in adequate detail. The creatures we know about, the Anomalocaris and the Dunkleosteus and the Inostrancevia and the Sarcosuchus and the Smilodon, and all the rest of the remarkable animals we have discussed in this documentary, are the visible peaks of a vast, submerged mountain range of biological history, the small proportion of ancient life whose existence we happen to be aware of because of the specific accidents of preservation, discovery, and study. What we are missing may be even more extraordinary than what we have found. There are entire geological periods from which we have almost no fossil material from certain regions of the world, vast stretches of time in certain environments from which the fossil record is essentially blank. There are soft-bodied organisms, animals without the hard parts that fossilize most readily, whose existence we can sometimes infer from trace fossils or chemical signatures, but whose biology we cannot reconstruct in any meaningful detail. There are behaviors and ecological relationships, the precise hunting strategies, the social structures, the vocalizations, the territorial ranges, the seasonal migrations of ancient predators, that leave no trace whatsoever in the fossil record, and that we can only approach through indirect inference and analogy with modern relatives. The paleontologist and author Stephen Jay Gould famously described the history of life as a drunkard's walk rather than a purposeful march toward complexity and perfection, a process driven by contingency and chance rather than by direction and necessity. What the story we have told in this documentary adds to Gould's observation is the recognition that even our ability to perceive that walk is severely limited by the incomplete nature of the record we are reading. We are reconstructing an extraordinarily complex narrative from fragments, from partial sentences and missing chapters, from a text that has been subjected to 500 million years of geological editing, with vast portions burned, flooded, chemically dissolved, or simply never written down in the first place. What we have then is not a complete history of predatory life on Earth, but a silhouette, a shape outlined by the evidence that happens to have survived, suggestive of the full form it traces but unable to fill in every detail. And that silhouette, incomplete as it is already so astonishing, so full of creatures and events and transitions that defy our expectations and challenge our assumptions, that we can only imagine with a mixture of wonder and humility what the complete picture might look like if we could see it. The question that this silhouette poses most urgently is not simply about the past, but about the nature of dominance itself. Throughout this entire account, we have watched as creature after creature, lineage after lineage, achieved what appeared to be decisive, unchallengeable ecological supremacy, only to be swept away by forces that the dominant creature could neither anticipate nor resist. The Anomalocaris ruled the Cambrian seas for tens of millions of years and then vanished. The placoderms dominated the Devonian oceans for even longer and then disappeared without leaving a single descendant. The Gorgonopsians owned the late Permian world and were gone within a geological instant. The mosasaurs transformed the Cretaceous seas in the span of a few million years and were erased just as quickly. Haast's eagle was eliminated in decades. What does this history tell us about the nature of biological dominance? Several things, and they are all interconnected. First, dominance is always conditional, dependent on the specific set of environmental conditions that happen to make a particular set of biological capabilities advantageous at a particular moment. Second, the more highly specialized a dominant organism becomes for exploiting those specific conditions, the more vulnerable it becomes when conditions change. Third, conditions always change because the Earth is not a static system but a dynamic one, driven by geological, astronomical, and biological processes that operate continuously and without regard for the preferences of any living organism. Fourth, and perhaps most profoundly, the very success of a dominant predator can contribute to the conditions that eventually undermine its dominance, either by depleting the prey base that sustains it, as in the case of the megafaunal hunters at the end of the Pleistocene, or by driving the evolution of prey defenses that reduce hunting efficiency, as in the countless arms races between predators and prey documented throughout the fossil record. Dominance in the long view of Earth's history is never a destination but always a process, never a stable state but always a dynamic equilibrium between an organism and the specific world it inhabits, an equilibrium that persists only as long as the organism and the world remain compatible, and that dissolves the moment that compatibility is broken. This is not a pessimistic conclusion but an honest one, and it is one that the entire 500 million year history we have explored in this documentary demands that we accept. We have now traveled across the full span of complex animal life on this planet, from the first active hunters of the Cambrian seas to the most recently vanished apex predators of the last few millennia. We have met animals of extraordinary diversity and capability. The alien magnificence of Anomalocaris, the crushing power of Dunkleosteus, the quasi-mammalian sophistication of Inostrancevia, the ecological dominance of Postsuchus, the marine enormity of Leopleurodon, the freshwater supremacy of Sarcosuchus, the serpentine vastness of Titanoboa, the avian grandeur of Gastornis, the saber-toothed elegance of Smilodon, the overwhelming bulk of Arctodus simus, the aerial precision of Haast's eagle, and the oceanic magnificence of Megalodon. Each of these animals was, in its time and place, the supreme expression of predatory evolution on this planet, the pinnacle of its particular ecological moment, and each of them is gone. Their bones lie in the rock, some discovered, most not, waiting in geological patience for the curious minds that might someday find them. The rock does not mourn them. The rock simply preserves whatever fragments it happened to capture of their existence, and offers those fragments, silently and without interpretation, to whoever comes looking. The interpretation is our task. The meaning is something we must construct from the fragments, and the meaning we construct reflects not only what the fossils tell us but what we bring to them. Our questions, our analytical tools, our theoretical frameworks, and our capacity for the kind of sustained, disciplined wonder that can look at a fossil tooth 18 centimeters long and reconstruct from it not just the shark it belonged to but the ocean that sustained that shark, the whales that feared it, the climate that shaped those whales, and the geological processes that determine that climate. The study of ancient life is, at its best, an act of deep imagination grounded in rigorous evidence, a reaching backward across inconceivable depths of time to touch the reality of a world that no longer exists. What remains to be said after 500 million years of predatory life have been surveyed and examined is something about the nature of the archive itself, about what we can and cannot learn from the fragments of the past, and about what the study of these vanished predators means for our understanding of the living world. The bones and teeth and trace fossils of ancient predators are remarkable objects. They are literally pieces of the living past, material from the bodies of organisms that breathed and moved and hunted in ancient worlds, preserved by a particular sequence of geological accidents and transported across hundreds of millions of years to the present moment. When a paleontologist holds a fossil tooth of megalodon, they are holding something that was once part of a living animal, something that was shaped by the same evolutionary processes that shaped every living thing on Earth today, something that connects the present to a past so remote that no human mind can fully comprehend the distance. But fossils are not just objects of wonder. They are scientific instruments of extraordinary power. They record information about ancient organisms that cannot be obtained any other way. The actual body plans of creatures that have no living relatives, the precise anatomy of structures that have no modern analogues, the chemical signatures of ancient environments preserved in bones and teeth, the behavioral evidence of predation and competition and social interaction recorded in the marks left on fossilized bones. The analytical techniques available to modern paleontologists, from computed tomography scanning to synchrotron radiation imaging to isotopic geochemistry to ancient protein analysis, have expanded the informational yield of fossils beyond what earlier generations of researchers could have imagined, and new techniques continue to be developed that extract new categories of information from the same ancient materials. The result is a science that is advancing rapidly, one in which the picture of ancient life that we have available to us today is dramatically more detailed, more nuanced, and more accurate than the picture that was available even a generation ago. Creatures that were barely known from fragmentary material are being reconstructed in remarkable detail as new fossils are discovered and new analytical techniques are applied to old ones. Behaviors that left no direct trace in the fossil record are being inferred with increasing confidence from indirect evidence. Ecological relationships that could only be guessed at are being illuminated by the application of sophisticated quantitative methods to large datasets of fossil information. The study of Earth's ancient predators is not a finished science but a rapidly evolving one, and the discoveries that await in the rocks of this planet are almost certainly going to astonish us in ways we cannot currently anticipate. The final thought we want to leave you with is one of perspective. We began this documentary by noting that the human mind is not equipped by evolution to intuit deep time, that the scale of geological and evolutionary history is simply too vast for our instinctive comprehension. We built bridges to that vast scale, compressed the history of life into a single day, tried to make the incomprehensible at least imaginable. But perhaps the most powerful perspective that the study of ancient predators offers is not one of temporal scale, but of biological humility. Every apex predator we have discussed in this documentary, from the Cambrian to the present, was, in its moment, the supreme achievement of evolutionary life on this planet. Each was the product of millions of years of refinement, the beneficiary of countless generations of selective pressure that had honed its capabilities to a peak of predatory effectiveness. Each occupied its ecological role with a completeness and an authority that, from within the perspective of its own world, must have seemed as permanent and as natural as the mountains and the seas. And each, without exception, was eventually gone, swept away by the same forces of planetary change that had created the conditions for its rise. We are the latest in this long sequence. Our own extraordinary capabilities, our intelligence, our technology, our global reach, are as much the products of specific evolutionary and environmental conditions as the saber teeth of Smilodon or the crushing jaws of Dunkleosteus. The world that produced us, the specific combination of climate, geography, prey availability, and competitive context that drove the evolution of our lineage, is itself a product of historical contingency, no more permanent and no more guaranteed to persist than the worlds that produced all the magnificent, vanished predators we have been studying. The bones of the forgotten titans of Earth's history are not merely scientific specimens. They are a message from the past, written in stone across hundreds of millions of years, and the message they carry is one of extraordinary achievement and extraordinary impermanence. The world is vast, the history is deep, and the parade of dominant life forms that has marched across the stage of this planet over the last 500 million years is a parade that has not yet ended. Every extinction has been followed by a recovery. Every catastrophe has produced its survivors. And from every generation of survivors, evolution has fashioned new and surprising life forms, new approaches to the old challenges of eating and being eaten, new expressions of the endless biological creativity of life on Earth. The titans of the past are forgotten by the living world, but preserved in the rock, waiting. And the titans of the future, whatever forms they may take, are already being shaped by the slow, invisible processes of evolution operating in the populations of living things that surround us today, accumulating the variations and the adaptations that will eventually, over timescales that dwarf the entire span of human history, produce creatures as alien and as magnificent as anything we have encountered in the extraordinary story we have been telling tonight. 500 million years of life. 500 million years of hunters and hunted, of ecological empires built and shattered, of biological innovations appearing and disappearing, of a planet remaking itself again and again in the image of whatever forms of life happen to thrive under the conditions of each particular geological moment. It is the longest, most complex, and most astonishing story this world has to tell, and we have only begun, barely scratched the surface of understanding it. These are the forgotten titans. This is their world, and for a brief, extraordinary moment, we have looked back across the immensity of time and seen them walking, swimming, stalking, soaring through the ancient light of a planet that was always, in the deepest sense, theirs.